She counted the coins in her father's hand, and when she reached 50-something inside, Eleanor Whitaker went quiet as a grave. She did not scream. She did not run. She lifted her chin, folded her trembling hands, and looked every one of those laughing faces dead in the eye. If they meant to sell her like a heifer, then by God they'd sell a woman who refused to look away. What none of them knew was that a stranger had stepped off his horse behind them, and he was about to ask the one question that would ruin their cruel morning. Before we go any further, if a story about a woman the world tried to throw away moves something in you, do me a kindness. Subscribe to this channel and stay with me clear to the end, because this one earns its ending. And tell me down in the comments what town you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far Eleanor's story travels. Now let's begin. The heat came off the dirt of Dust Creek like the breath of an open oven, and the whole town had turned out for it. They said they'd come for the cattle sale. That was the lie they told each other. 15 head of longhorns stood penned behind the mercantile tails, switching flies, and not one soul was looking at them. Every eye in that dusty square was fixed on the wooden loading platform where old Harlan Whitaker had made his daughter stand. $50. Harlan called out again louder, like a man selling a plow horse gone lame. You hear me, 50. That's all she's worth, and I'm being generous. Nobody laughed the first time he said it. By the third time they did. Eleanor stood where he'd put her. She'd stopped listening to the words some minutes ago, because the words weren't the thing that hurt. It was the faces. Faces she'd known her whole life. Mrs. Pruitt from the church social, who'd once complimented her preserves. The Dawson boys grown now who'd sat behind her in the schoolhouse. Reverend Coyle himself standing at the back with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed carefully on the ground, saying nothing. That was the part that broke something loose in her chest. Not the cruelty of the ones who spoke, the silence of the ones who didn't. Come on now, Harlan, a man hollered from near the water trough. Ain't nobody paying 50 for that. Girl's built like the barn she ought to be sleeping in. The laughter came easy that time. Eleanor felt her face go hot. Felt the sting climb up behind her eyes, and she pressed her fingernails hard into her palms until the sting went somewhere else. She would not cry. She had decided that much when her father woke her before dawn and told her to put on her good dress. She hadn't known then what he meant to do. She knew now, and she'd be damned before she'd give them the tears. She cooks, Harlan said, ticking it off on his fingers like he was reading a bill of sale. Cleans, sews a straight seam, strong back on her, whatever else you want to say. A man could do worse for $50. A man could do a sight better for free, someone answered, and the square rippled with it again. Harlan's jaw tightened. He wasn't a cruel man in the way of men who enjoyed it. He was worse, a weak man, a man drowning in debt to the bank and the bottle both, and a weak man will do a cruel thing quick and call it necessary. He'd buried Eleanor's mother 2 winters back. He'd sold the milk cow last spring. Now there was one thing left in the house that ate food and took up space and brought no coin, and he'd decided that thing was his daughter. 40 then, Harlan said, and his voice cracked on it. $40 and I'll throw in her mother's sewing box. Somebody give me a fair price for the girl. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought, and she hated herself for thinking it, that maybe it would be easier if somebody just did. If somebody paid the money and led her off, and it was over. Whatever came after couldn't be worse than standing here. Couldn't be worse than her own father's hand held out for coins with her standing on the other end of it. That was the thing they'd done to her, all of them, over 25 years. They'd taught her to believe it, that she was a burden, that she had to earn the air she breathed. That kindness, when it came, was a debt she'd have to work off on her knees. She had gotten so used to making herself small that she'd nearly forgotten a body could stand up straight. She thought of her mother then standing in a summer kitchen years ago, flour to her elbows, saying, "Eleanor, you hold your head up in this world, you hear me. Folks'll take exactly what you let them take, and not one thing more." Her mother had believed that. Her mother had died believing it, coughing her lungs out in a bed Harlan couldn't afford to make softer, and where had holding her head up gotten her but a pine box on the poor side of the churchyard? How much for just the dress? A woman called out, and the square laughed again. Betsy Ann Dawson. That was the very girl who used to copy Eleanor's sums in the schoolhouse and never once said thank you. That's good navy cotton. Shame to waste it on her. You'll want the whole girl, Betsy Ann, a man answered. She'd keep a whole family fed just off the scraps she don't need. Eleanor did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only told them where the soft places were, and they were always hunting for the soft places. So she stood, and she let it wash over her, and inside her chest she said her mother's words over and over like a psalm. Hold your head up, hold your head up. Not one thing more than you let them take. I'll take her. The voice came from the crowd's edge, and it wasn't a shout. That was what made everyone turn. In all that jeering, a low and level voice cut cleaner than any yell. A man walked out of the crowd. Nobody knew him. Trail dust on his boots, a plain hat pulled low, a leather vest gone brown with age and sun. He led a horse behind him by the reins and stopped it easy at the foot of the platform. Broad through the shoulders in the way of men who'd worked land their whole lives, and there was gray coming in at his temples that said he'd been at it a long while. He looked up at Harlan. Not at Eleanor. At Harlan. You the one selling, the stranger said. It wasn't a question. Harlan straightened quick to smell money. That's right, $40, $35 for a man who looks like he means it. Caleb Thornton. The stranger tipped his hat an inch the way a man does when the manners are habit and not warmth. I don't believe we've met. We ain't. You from up the mountain, that Thornton place. I am. Caleb looped his horse's reins over the hitch rail, slow, taking his time about it. Came down for flour and nails, wasn't planning on a crowd. Well, you're in luck, Harlan said, and there was something desperate crawling into his grin now. Best deal in the territory standing right here, 35 and she's... Did anyone, Caleb said, ever ask her what she wanted? The square went quiet. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a glass falls and nobody's caught it yet. Harlan's grin hung on his face, forgotten. Mrs. Pruitt stopped fanning herself. Even the Dawson boys shut their mouths. Caleb hadn't raised his voice. That was the terrible part. He'd said it plain the way you'd ask a man the time. What? Harlan said. The girl. Caleb nodded up toward the platform, and only now did his eyes travel to Eleanor, and when they did, she felt it like a hand laid flat against something that had been struck too many times. He wasn't looking at her body. Every other man in that square had looked at her body first, measured it, priced it, made a joke of it. This man looked at her face, looked her right in the eye like she was a person standing there and not a sack of grain on a scale. She's standing right there. She's got ears. You asked half the county to name a price on her. I'm asking if anybody thought to ask her a single thing at all. She's my daughter, Harlan snapped. She don't need asking. She does what I heard you say she cooks and cleans and sews. Caleb's voice never rose. I heard a dozen men in this square say worse than that. What I ain't heard... He paused, and the pause landed heavier than a shout. Is one word out of her. Every face in Dust Creek turned to Eleanor. She had not moved. Her fingernails were still buried in her palms. Her heart was slamming so hard she was sure the whole square could see it through the navy cotton of her dress. And the man at the foot of the platform was waiting for her, like her answer was worth the wait, and she did not have the first idea what to do with that, because no one had waited on her word in longer than she could remember. Speak up, girl! Her father hissed low, just for her. Don't you shame me worse. And something about that, the word shame coming from him, from the man holding out his hand for her price, struck a match somewhere deep down that she'd thought long since gone wet. I don't want to be sold, Eleanor said. It came out small. It came out shaking. But it came out, and it was the first thing she'd said aloud all morning, and her own voice startled her. There, Harlan barked. See, she talks. Now can we... That's not what I asked her. Caleb hadn't looked away from Eleanor once. Miss, I asked what you wanted, not what you don't. There's a difference. She stared at him. Her mind had gone white and useless. What did she want? She hadn't been asked that question in so long she'd forgotten the shape of it. She wanted her mother back. She wanted to go one day of her life without a joke made at the size of her. She wanted to stop apologizing every time she took up room in a doorway. She wanted, "I want to leave," she said. "I don't care where. I just want to be gone from here." A murmur went through the crowd. Someone laughed short and mean and cut it off when Caleb's head turned a quarter-inch toward the sound. $60, Caleb said, turning back to Harlan. Harlan blinked. "You said—" "I know what I said. I'm saying 60 now." Caleb reached into his vest and counted the coins out into his palm, slow, letting each one drop with a small, hard sound. "And I'm buying one thing with it. You're going to hand me that bill of sale, and then you're going to understand what it means. It means you signed her over. It means you got no more claim. It means the next time you come looking to sell her, there'll be nothing left of yours to sell." He set the coins on the edge of the platform. "That worth 60 to you?" Harlan looked at the coins. He looked at his daughter, and Eleanor watched. She would remember this the rest of her days. She watched her own father count $60 as the better bargain than the girl he'd raised. "Deal?" Harlan said, and scooped the coins so fast one dropped and rolled in the dirt, and he went down on his knees after it in front of the whole town. That was when a new voice spoke. And this one Eleanor knew. "Now hold on." The crowd parted for him, the way crowds part for a man they're afraid of. Josiah Crane owned the freight line, the saloon, and half the paper on every farm within 30 miles of Dust Creek, including everyone suspected the paper on Harlan Whitaker's ruined little homestead. He was a big man run to fat, dressed too fine for the dust, and he walked up to the platform with the ease of a man who had never once in his life been told no. "I'd have paid 100, Crane said, and he smiled up at Eleanor in a way that made the $60 morning seem gentle by comparison. "Harlan, you old fool, you didn't even ask me. I've had my eye on the girl. Big, quiet, grateful type. That's a useful thing to have around a place like mine." Eleanor felt the cold go all the way down to her feet. She knew what a place like Crane's was. Everyone knew. The girls who worked the rooms above his saloon did not stay girls long, and they did not leave. She had lain awake on more than one night, thanking God she was too plain and too poor to catch a man like that's eye, and here he stood, telling the whole square he'd been watching her all along. "Sale's done, Mr. Crane," Caleb said. "Sale's done when I say it's done." Crane didn't even look at him. "Harlan, give the mountain man his money back. I'll double it. 200, and I'll forgive that note you've been ducking me on since March. What do you say to that?" And Harlan weak. Harlan drowning. Harlan with the debt around his neck like a stone turned the $60 over in his hand and looked from Crane to Caleb and back, and Eleanor saw the whole terrible arithmetic of it moving behind her father's eyes. "The bill of sale's already signed," Caleb said quietly. "It ain't signed till I see ink," Crane said. He climbed the 2 steps up onto the platform slow and stood beside Eleanor close enough that she could smell the bay rum and the cigar smoke on him, and he did not look at her the way a man looks at a woman. He looked at her the way a man looks at a wagon he's fixing to buy, checking the wheels. The axle what it'll haul before it breaks down on him. "Look at her, Thornton. Look close. You're a rancher. You know good stock when you see it, and you know when a man's trying to unload a burden. Which do you figure this is?" "I figure," Caleb said, "that you just called a Christian woman's stock in front of a preacher, and the preacher still ain't said a word." His eyes went to the back of the crowd, to Reverend Coyle standing there with his hat in his hands. "That right, Reverend. This how it's done in your town. Man of God watches a girl get auctioned off a loading dock and studies his own boots." Reverend Coyle's face went the color of ash. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. "That's what I thought," Caleb said, and turned back to Crane. "You're new here?" Crane said, still pleasant. "So I'll say it kindly. I own the note on half this valley. I own the freight that brings you your nails and your flour. Man makes an enemy of me, he finds the whole world gets awful narrow, awful fast. Now step down off my morning." "Your morning?" Caleb's voice never lifted. "You keep saying that, like the girl belongs to it. Like she belongs to you already, and we're just squaring up the details. He shook his head slow. No, sir. Her father sold her. I bought her. And the first thing I aim to do with $60 worth of anything is give it back to itself. So here's where we are, Crane. You want to double my money, I'll thank you to keep it. You want to forgive that note that's between you and Harlan. But there's not enough coin in your freight office to buy a thing that's already been set free. Crane's smile thinned. 200 Harlan. And the note torn up. Today. It ain't signed till I see ink, Crane had said. And now Caleb turned to Harlan, and for the first time there was something under the level calm of his voice, something with an edge on it. Whitaker. You look at me now. That girl is standing 10 feet away listening to two men bid on her life like she's a horse gone to auction. You already did that to her once this morning. You want to be the man who does it to her twice? She's worth 200 to me, Crane said, pleasant as Sunday again. She's worth more than the both of us put together, and you know it, Caleb said, which is exactly why a man like you wants her cheap and quiet. The square held its breath. Eleanor looked at Caleb Thornton, this stranger. This man she had known for the length of a single terrible conversation, and she understood all at once that he was not going to lose. Not because he wanted her. She'd have staked her life he didn't. There wasn't a scrap of wanting in how he looked at her. He was going to win because he'd decided somewhere in the last 5 minutes that a wrong was being done in front of him, and he was the kind of man who could not walk past a wrong, the way the rest of them had walked past it their whole lives. Harlan, Crane said, and his voice had lost its pleasantness now. You owe me $400. I can call that note today. Today, Harlan. You'd lose the house before supper. He let that sit. Or you can tear up the mountain man's paper, take my 200, and we forget the whole business. Your choice. Harlan's hand was shaking. The $60 rattled in it. Pa, Eleanor said. It was the first time she'd spoken to him directly since he'd woken her that morning. He flinched at it, like she'd raised a hand to him. Pa, look at me. He wouldn't. He stared at the coins. You already sold me, she said, and her voice was steadier now, though she didn't know where the steadiness was coming from. You can't do it twice. You made your bargain. You got your money. It's the one honest thing you've done all day. Don't take it back now. She swallowed. Please. Not to him. You know what he is. Mama knew what he was. At the mention of her mother, something moved across Harlan Whitaker's ruined face. Grief or shame, or the ghost of the man he'd been before the debt, and the drink hollowed him out. He looked up at his daughter for the first time all morning. Really looked. I never meant, he started. I know. Eleanor said, though she didn't, and it wasn't true, and both of them heard that it wasn't. Just let me go, Pa. Let this be the once you let me go. The whole square was silent. Even Crane had stopped smiling. Harlan Whitaker looked down at the $60 in his shaking hand. Then he looked at Caleb Thornton. It's signed, he said hoarsely. The paper's signed. Sale's done. He turned to Crane, and something almost like a spine straightened in him for the space of a breath. You want to call my note Josiah, you call it. I'll lose the house. Reckon I've lost worse today. His voice broke. Reckon I've lost about everything worth keeping today. Crane's face went hard and flat. He looked at Harlan a long moment, and then he turned that look on Caleb Thornton, and the two men stood measuring each other across the dust. Mountain man, Crane said softly. You just made yourself a poor bargain and a bad enemy on the same morning. That girl'll eat you out of house and home and give you nothing back, and I'm a man who remembers a face. He smiled, and there was nothing in it. I'll be seeing you, both of you. I expect you will, Caleb said. Dust Creek's a small town. Crane turned and walked back through the crowd, and this time nobody parted for him quite so quick. Caleb reached up. Eleanor understood after a frozen moment that he was offering his hand, offering to help her down off the platform where her father had stood her up to be sold. She looked at the hand. Broad brown calloused, steady. The first hand held out to her in longer than she could say that wasn't asking her for something. You don't have to, he said quiet, just for her. I'll not lay a finger on you. You don't want laid. but it's a long step down and I'd hate to see you turn an ankle in front of these fine people." The smallest thing, and it undid her more than all the cruelty had. She put her hand in his. He handed her down off the platform, like she was somebody, like she was a lady stepping out of a church, and set her on her feet in the dust and let go of her hand the moment she was steady. Let go quick, like he was giving something back, rather than taking something. "Thornton," she said. Her voice was barely there. "I don't have anything. I can't pay you back the 60. I can't pay you back any of it. If you brought me up that mountain expecting—" "I don't expect anything, ma'am." He'd already turned to gather his horse's reins, and he said it over his shoulder like it was the plainest fact in the world. "You don't owe me $60. You don't owe me 60 cents. What happened here today, that was between me and my own conscience, and I paid it, and it's square." He looked back at her. "You want to come up the mountain, there's a spare room, and it locks from the inside, and I'll show you which door is yours before I show you anything else. You want to go somewhere else, tell me where, and I'll see you get there safe. But there's not a version of this where you owe me. You understand?" She did not understand. That was the plain truth of it. She stood there in the dust of the town that had tried to sell her, holding her mother's sewing box, which somebody she never learned who had set down quietly at her feet. And she looked at this weathered stranger, telling her she owed him nothing, and not one word of it fit inside her. Because everyone had always wanted something. That was the only law she knew. "Why?" she said. It was all she could manage. "Why'd you do it? You don't know me. You saw what they all saw. You heard what he said I was worth." Caleb Thornton stopped. He held his horse's reins and looked at Eleanor Whitaker a long moment, and around them the crowd was beginning to break up and drift away, muttering, robbed of its cruel entertainment. "I heard what he said you were worth," Caleb said finally. $50, then 40. Then he'd have taken 35. He shook his head slow. "Ma'am, I've bought and sold a lot of things in my life. Cattle, land, horses. A man learns to know the worth of a thing." He swung up into the saddle and looked down at her, and for just a second, under all that trail dust and gray and weathered calm, she saw something she wouldn't understand for a long while. Yet the look of a man who'd once been thrown away himself and had never forgotten the size of the hole it left. "And I'll tell you what I know for certain," he said. "Every single soul in this square today priced you wrong." He turned his horse toward the mountain road. "Come on if you're coming, Miss Whitaker. It's a long ride up and the light don't last." And Eleanor Whitaker, the woman they had tried to sell that morning for $50, picked up her mother's sewing box, lifted her chin, and walked out of Dust Creek on her own 2 feet, following a stranger up the mountain toward whatever came next. She did not look back at her father. She never learned whether he watched her go. They rode most of the way up the mountain without a word between them. Eleanor walked at first, until Caleb slowed his horse and told her plain that it was 6 miles of climbing and no sense in her ruining her feet to prove something to a man who wasn't keeping score. She almost refused out of habit. Then she thought of the town behind her and the blisters already starting, and she let him hand her up behind the saddle, and she held the sewing box in her lap and kept a careful foot of air between her back and his, and she waited. That was the thing she was doing the whole ride. Waiting. She knew how this went. A man did a kindness, and then somewhere quiet, somewhere with no witnesses, he collected on it. She'd seen it happen to other women. She'd braced for it her whole life. So she rode up that mountain, cataloging the ways it could come, the hand that would wander, the voice that would drop low, the moment the kindness turned its true face to her. It never came. "You can breathe," Caleb said near the top, not turning around. "You've been holding it since the square. I can feel it through the saddle." "I'm fine." "Didn't say you weren't." He clicked his tongue, and the horse picked its way around a washout. "Just said you can breathe." She didn't answer. But she noticed her own shoulders had climbed up around her ears somewhere back down the trail, and she made them come down 1 inch, and that 1 inch was the hardest work she'd done all day. The place when they reached it was smaller than she'd braced for, and cleaner than she'd expected of a man living alone. He swung down first and stood well back from the horse, giving her room, and when she climbed down clumsy, he looked away on purpose so she wouldn't feel him watching her manage it. "Amos," he called toward the barn. "We got a guest. Set another plate." A man came out wiping his hands on a rag older than Caleb, by a good 10 years gray all through his beard, moving with the careful economy of a man whose knees had opinions. He looked at Eleanor, and she waited for the flick of the eyes up and down the small smirk, the thing she always got. It didn't come. He just nodded at her grave and easy, the way you'd nod at a neighbor. "Ma'am," Amos said, "you hungry boy here don't feed guests right. I'll fix that. She's not a—" Caleb started, then stopped like he didn't have the word for what she was, and didn't want to guess wrong in front of her. "Her name's Miss Whitaker. She'll be staying a spell. That room off the kitchen, the one with the good door." "The one that locks," Amos said. "The one that locks," Caleb agreed. Amos looked at Eleanor a moment longer, and something in his weathered face softened, and she got the sense he understood more of her mourning than she'd said out loud. "Locks from the inside that door," he told her. "Keys on a nail by the frame. You keep it. Ain't nobody up here got call to open a door you shut." He said it plain like a fact of weather, and then he turned and went to see about the plate. Eleanor stood holding her sewing box in the middle of a strange yard on a strange mountain, and did not know what to do with any of it. That first night she did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, with the door locked and the key in her fist, and she waited for the sound of a hand on the latch. She'd have told anyone she was too tired to be afraid. She was afraid anyway. Fear like hers doesn't listen to reason. It had been trained into her too long. She watched the gray square of the window go black and then go gray again, and no hand ever touched the door, and somehow that frightened her worse than if one had. Because a man who wanted the ordinary things she understood. A man who wanted nothing that was a door she couldn't see behind, and she'd learned the hard way that the doors you can't see behind are the ones that open onto the worst rooms. So she decided sometime before dawn that she would find the catch herself. She would work so hard, be so useful, cost so little, that whatever he was waiting to demand of her, she'd have paid it down to nothing before he ever got to ask. She was in the kitchen before the sky was light. By the time Caleb came in stamping the cold off his boots, she'd blacked the stove and scrubbed the table and had biscuits going and a pot of coffee strong enough to trot a mouse across, and she'd found his mending pile and set the worst of it right. She stood by the stove with her hands twisted in her borrowed apron and watched his face trying to read the price in it. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the clean table and the biscuits and the mending folded neat on the chair. And then he looked at her, and she braced for the pleasure in it, the satisfaction of a man seeing his investment start to pay. "How long you been up?" he said. "Since 4, maybe before." She lifted her chin. "I can do more. I can do the wash, and I saw the garden's gone to weeds, and Amos said the henhouse wants cleaning, and I'll have supper on before you're back from the—" "Miss Whitaker." He said it quiet. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavy, and he didn't reach for a biscuit, and that scared her more than anything. "Sit down a minute." There it was. Her stomach dropped clean through the floor. Here it comes. She'd known it would. She stayed standing. "I'd rather stand." "All right." He turned his hat over in his hands, slow like a man choosing his footing on ice. "That's a lot of work you did before sunup." "I'll do more. I don't doubt it. That's what worries me." He set the hat down. "Who taught you that you had to—" The question landed somewhere she wasn't guarding. She opened her mouth to give the easy answer and found she didn't have one. That's how it works," she said. "You feed a body, the body earns its feed. That's just how it works," he finished for her. "Somebody said that to you a lot, I expect. Somebody said it till you believed it in your bones." He looked at her steady. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear the whole of it, not just the front half. You don't have to earn your right to exist. You breathing my air don't cost me a thing. You taking up space at my table don't cost me a thing. There is no bill coming, Miss Whitaker. There is no day where I sit you down and tell you what you owe. You could do not one lick of work from now till Christmas, and I'd feed you the same." She stared at him. Her hands had started to shake, and she pressed them flat against her apron to stop it. "Then why?" she said, and her voice cracked and she hated it. "Why bring me up here? Why pay $60 for a woman you don't want to work and don't want anything from? Men don't do that. There's no such man. You're waiting for something, and I'd rather you just say it than have me lie awake guessing what it is." For a long moment, Caleb didn't answer. 20 years back, he said finally, "I got sold too." Eleanor went still. "Not off a loading dock. Nobody stood me up in a square. But I was 14, and my daddy owed a man money, and the man took me instead of the money. Bound me over. Called it work. But it wasn't work, it was owning. And I did 4 years of it before I was big enough to walk off and dare him to stop me." He turned his hat again. "Whole time I kept thinking somebody'd come. Somebody with sensa'd look at what was happening and say, 'Now hold on, that ain't right, you can't just do that to a person.' Kept waiting on that somebody my whole 4 years." He looked up at her. "Nobody ever came. Not once. Not one soul in that county would meet my eye. The kitchen was dead quiet. So when I rode into Dust Creek for flour and nails," he said, "and I heard a man putting a price on his own daughter. And I looked around that square and saw every last one of them studying their boots." His jaw worked. "I found out I'd been that somebody all along. The one who was supposed to come. Just took me 20 years and a stranger's bad morning to figure out what I was for." He stood up. "That's your why, Miss Whitaker. There ain't a catch in it. I did for you what nobody'd do for me. It's the only clean thing I've done in a long while, and I'd take it very kindly if you'd stop trying to pay for it." He put his hat on. He went to the door. "Eat a biscuit," he said. "You made 'em. They're yours." And he was gone out into the cold before she could answer. Eleanor sat down at last in the chair he'd pulled out, and she looked at the biscuits she'd made in her fear, and something in her chest that had been clenched so long she'd forgotten it could open. Opened just a crack, and it hurt like a hand coming back to life. She did not eat. She put her face in her borrowed apron, and she cried silent and shaking the way she'd taught herself to cry so nobody would hear, and she couldn't have said for the life of her whether it was grief or relief, because after 25 years of the two braided together, she'd lost the trick of telling them apart. The days after that ran together in a way she wasn't used to, because they held no dread in them. She kept working she couldn't have stopped if she'd tried. The working was too deep in her, but the working started to feel different. Not like paying down a debt, like tending a thing she was allowed to care about. She learned the place a piece at a time. She learned that Amos hummed hymns off-key when he thought no one could hear, and that he'd been with Caleb since the beginning, since Caleb bought the first 40 acres with the last of the money he'd saved walking off his own bondage. She learned there was a boy too, Tom Pruitt, a nephew of the very Mrs. Pruitt who'd stood in the square and said nothing. Tom came up 3 days a week to help with the stock, and he was maybe 16 and terrified of everything, and the first time Eleanor set a full plate in front of him, he looked at it like it might be a trick. "You don't gotta give me the big piece, ma'am," Tom said. "I know I don't," Eleanor said. "Eat it anyway." And she heard coming out of her own mouth a thing that had been said to her 4 days before over a plate of biscuits, and she watched the boy hear it the way she'd heard it, and something turned over in her chest that she hadn't expected. She'd spent her whole life on the receiving end of the world's mercy, what little there was of it. She had never once been the one to hand it down. It felt, she thought, like the first honest work she'd ever done. "Where'd he find you?" Tom asked her once low when Caleb was out of the room. "Mr. Thornton? Folks in town are saying things." "What things?" The boy went red. "That he bought you. Off a platform. Like a—" He couldn't finish it. Eleanor set down the pan she was holding. She could feel the old shame rising up her neck, the reflex to make herself small to apologize for the shape of her own story. And then she thought of Caleb saying, "You don't have to earn your right to exist," and she stood up straight instead. "They're saying it right," she told the boy, and her voice didn't shake. "My father put me up for sale, and Mr. Thornton paid the price. But he didn't buy me, Tom. There's a difference, and you're old enough to learn it. A man who buys a person owns them. A man who buys their freedom and hands it back, that's not a buyer. I don't know the word for what that is, but it's the opposite of what your town tried to do to me." She picked the pan back up. "Now eat your supper before it's cold, and quit believing the worst about people just because it's the easiest thing to believe. That's a habit'll cost you your whole life." The boy stared at her. Then he ducked his head and ate, and after that, he watched her the way you watch someone you've decided to trust, and Eleanor found she'd made another thing she hadn't meant to make. A person who looked up to her. Lord, what a strange country this mountain was. It was on the 9th night that she noticed she'd left her door unlocked. She'd gone to bed with the key on its nail and not in her fist, and she'd slept whole and deep and dreamless, and woke to gray light with the key still hanging where it belonged, and the door still shut, and no hand ever come to try it. She lay there a long moment, understanding what her own body had done without asking her permission. It had decided it was safe. After 25 years of never once being safe, it had picked this hard mountain and this quiet man, and simply without ceremony, laid the fear down. She didn't tell Caleb. But at breakfast he looked at her a beat longer than usual, and she had the uncomfortable notion that he knew that Amos had mentioned the key was on its nail, and that these two rough men had somehow agreed between them not to say a word about it for fear of scaring the thing back into hiding. It touched her more than any speech could have. Men who understood that some kindnesses are best done by pretending not to notice. She did not know that the first real trouble was already riding up the mountain. It came 4 days later in the person of a man named Dab Fenner, who worked for Josiah Crane, and looked it. He rode into the yard mid-morning with 2 other men behind him, and didn't get down, which was its own kind of insult, a man staying horsed in another man's yard. Amos saw them first and came to the kitchen door. "Girl," he said low, "get in your room. Lock it." "Who are they?" "Crane's men. Go on now." But she didn't go. She stood at the window with the curtain edge in her fist and watched Caleb walk out to meet them. Easy wiping his hands like 3 armed men in his yard was a thing that happened every day. "Fenner," Caleb said, "you're a long way up the mountain. Mr. Crane sends his regards." Dab Fenner had a voice like a rusted hinge. "Says he's been going through his ledgers. Says that note on the Whitaker place the one old Harlan couldn't pay. Turns out it's got a lien clause. Anything of value that leaves that property while the note's outstanding that belongs to the note holder." He smiled down at Caleb. "Girl was property of that homestead. Girl left the homestead. Girl belongs to Mr. Crane. He'll be wanting her back, or the 200 he offered, whichever you'd rather part with." Eleanor's blood went to ice. Caleb didn't move. "That's a lie so crooked it'd have to be screwed into the ground," he said pleasantly. "There's no lien clause makes a person into property. Not in this territory. Not anywhere the war's been fought over. Mr. Crane's got a lawyer says different. Mr. Crane's got a lawyer he pays to say whatever." Caleb hooked his thumbs in his belt. "You ride back down and you tell Josiah Crane that Miss Whitaker's father sold her free and clear in front of 40 witnesses. Money changed hands, bill of sale signed. She's not property. She never was. And if she was, she'd be mine, and I don't sell." He took 1 step closer to Fenner's horse, and there was nothing pleasant left in him now. "And you tell him the next man he sends up my mountain to talk about buying a woman I'll send back down over his own saddle. You understand me, Dab." Something passed between the 2 men. Some old measuring, and Eleanor understood that Caleb Thornton was not a man these 3 wanted to test at short range, whatever their numbers. Fenner's smile stayed, but his eyes went flat. "He said you'd say that." He gathered his reins. "He also said to tell you he's a patient man, and that a woman like that costs money to keep, and mountains cost money to keep, and he's real curious how a man does both on what your little spread brings in." He tipped his hat mocking. "Real curious about your books, Mr. Thornton. Man in debt makes mistakes. You have yourself a day." They rode off. Caleb watched them clear out of sight before he turned, and when he did, his face had gone gray under the tan, and Eleanor knew the way. You know a thing before you've reasoned it, that Fenner had struck something true with that last word. She met him at the door. What did he mean? About your books? Nothing you need to... Don't. It came out sharper than she'd ever spoken to a man in her life, and she was as startled by it as he was. Don't do that. Don't put me in a room and lock the door on the trouble I'm the cause of. He came here for me. If there's a rope around your neck, it's got my name on it. So you tell me. What did he mean about your books? Caleb looked at her a long moment. Then he did something she never expected. He stepped aside and held the door and said, "Come see for yourself then. God knows I can't make heads nor tails of it." The books were a mess. She saw that inside of 2 minutes at the little desk by the window, the ledger open under her hands and the light coming in over her shoulder. She'd kept books before her mother had taught her figures when Eleanor was 8. Said a woman who could cipher would never be wholly at any man's mercy. And hadn't that turned out to be the one thing the world couldn't strip off her? She turned the pages, and the further she went, the tighter something drew in her chest, and it wasn't fear this time. It was the cold, clean anger of a person watching a robbery in slow motion. "Who buys your supplies?" she said. "Crane's freight office. Only game in the valley." "Why?" "Because you're paying near double what you ought." She ran her finger down a column. "Look here. Nails 40 pounds this price, and here 3 months on same 40 pounds of nails up a third, and here up again. Flour the same, wire the same. Every line item off Crane's freight climbs and never once comes down, and there's no market on God's earth where every single price only ever goes up." She looked at him. "He's been bleeding you slow. A little more every quarter. Not enough any one time that you'd notice, but added across 3 years. She flipped back, ran a fast sum in her head, and her stomach turned. "Caleb, he's overcharged you near $400. That's not bad luck. That's a man draining a well 1 dipper at a time, so the owner won't see the water dropping." Caleb had gone very still behind her. "Say that number again." "400, give or take." She turned in the chair to look at him. "How much do you owe on this place?" The silence told her before he did. 400, he said quietly. "On the dot. Note comes due in the fall." For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the whole shape of it hung in the air between them, ugly and clear. Crane hadn't been bleeding Caleb by accident. Crane had been building the exact debt he meant to collect brick by brick, quarter by quarter, so that when the note fell due, Caleb couldn't pay, and the mountain Caleb's clean, free, hard-won mountain would drop into Crane's hand like fruit off a shook tree. "He didn't come up here about you," Eleanor breathed. "Not really. You made it personal taking me in. But the mountain's what he was always after. He's been after it for years." She pressed her hand to her mouth. "And now he's got a reason to hurry." Caleb pulled a chair around and sat down hard across from her. "How do you know all this? The figures? How to read it?" "My mother." Eleanor closed the ledger, kept her hand flat on the cover like she could hold the truth down inside it. "She said a woman with a head for numbers has a wall between herself and every man who'd use her. I thought all these years it was the one useless thing about me nobody could sell." A short, disbelieving laugh escaped her. "The town priced me at $50, and I'm sitting here looking at 400 that a rich man stole because nobody in his life could add." Something moved across Caleb's face then that she'd not seen there before. Not gratitude exactly. Something harder to bear than gratitude. "You know what you just did," he said slowly. "You just found the knife he had at my throat. Been there 3 years, and I never felt it." He shook his head. "Every soul in that square looked at you and saw $50 and a fat girl in a old dress. And you walk into my house, and inside a week you find the thing that's been quietly killing me." He stood up restless and went to the window and stood looking down the mountain the way Fenner's men had gone. "There's your worth, Miss Whitaker. Right there. And they'd have sold it for $50 and never known what they threw away." Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't. She sat with her hand on the ledger and let the words settle into her like water into cracked ground. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt not like a burden being carried, but like a person who had done something changed. Something mattered to the outcome of a thing. It didn't last. It couldn't. Because that same evening, Amos came in from riding the south fence with his face grim and a paper in his hand. "Found this nailed to the gatepost," he said, and set it on the table. "Crane, don't waste time." It was a notice of foreclosure, formal, lawyered, stamped. It moved the due date on Caleb's note up from the fall to the end of the month, 3 weeks off, citing a clause about material change in the security's circumstances, which was a lawyer's way of saying you took in a woman I want and now I'm going to burn you down for it. "He can't do that," Eleanor said. "Can he move the date?" "He can do whatever a man does when he owns the judge, the sheriff, and the only lawyer inside 40 miles, Amos said heavily. "Which is to say he can do it, and it don't have to be legal, it just has to hold long enough." Caleb read the notice twice. Then he set it down, and Eleanor watched him do a thing she would think about for a long while after she watched him take the fear that was surely in him and fold it up small and put it away somewhere so that when he spoke, his voice was level as a table. 3 weeks, he said, to find $400 I don't have. "Or lose the mountain," Amos said. "Or lose the mountain." Eleanor looked at the two men, and at the notice, and at the ledger still sitting where she'd left it, and something was building in her that she didn't have a name for yet. 25 years of making herself small, of apologizing for the space she took, of believing the world's price on her. And here was the world in the shape of Josiah Crane, coming to take the one place she'd ever been handed a locked door and told the key was hers. Coming to take it partly because of her. Some old thing in her would have shrunk from that. Would have offered to leave, to go back down, to hand herself over, and take the trouble with her. Because that was what a burden did, a burden removed itself. But that old thing had cracked in the kitchen 4 days back, when a hard man told her she didn't have to earn her air. And through the crack, something new was coming up. "He wants me to run," she said slowly. "Doesn't he? That's part of it. He figures the decent thing, the thing a woman like me's been trained to do, is take myself out of it so I don't cost you the mountain. He's counting on me leaving." "Miss Whitaker," Caleb started. "He's wrong." She stood up from the desk, and she didn't know when she'd decided it, but she found it already decided, sitting solid in her chest, like a stone that had been there all along, waiting for her to notice it. "I'm not going anywhere. He built that $400 one crooked dipper at a time, and he wrote it all down in his own freight ledgers, thinking nobody who'd ever cross him could read a column of figures." She put her hand flat on Caleb's ledger. "But it's in my head now, every line, every quarter, every place it doesn't add. And a debt built on a fraud isn't a debt. It's evidence, and I can prove it." The kitchen went quiet. "Prove it to who?" Amos said carefully. "He owns the law down there. Then we go over the law." Eleanor's heart was slamming, but her voice, to her own amazement, held steady. "There's a federal land office in Denver. There's a circuit judge that doesn't answer to Josiah Crane. A man who steals from his own customers to force a foreclosure. A man who forges a lien to claim a person that's not a Dust Creek matter anymore. That's fraud across a territory. And fraud you can prove with numbers in front of the right man." She looked from Amos to Caleb. "He thinks the only thing I'm good for is what my father priced me at. Let him keep thinking it. Let him keep being careless with his books. Because I'm about to add up every dollar that man ever stole, and I'm going to hand the sum to somebody he can't buy." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Caleb Thornton did something Eleanor had never once seen him do. He smiled, a real one, slow and surprised, like a man watching the weather turn against all prediction. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I believe I finally know what I paid $60 for. And I'll tell you true, it was the cheapest thing I ever bought in my life." But even as he said it down in Dust Creek, Josiah Crane was sitting in the back of his saloon with the Whitaker note in front of him and Dab Fenner across the table, and he was not a man who left a fruit to chance once he'd decided to shake the tree. "She reads figures, you say," Crane said. "That's what Fenner heard from the boy that delivers their mail," his lawyer answered. "Old Harlan bragged on it once before the drink took the pride out of him. Said his girl could cipher like a bank clerk." Crane turned that over slow, and the smile that came to him was not a good one. "Then she'll have found it by now," he said. "The overcharges. Smart girl looks at 3 years of my freight bills, she'll see the pattern inside a week." He tapped the note. "Which means she's not a woman anymore, gentlemen. She's a witness. And I've spent too long and too much on that mountain to lose it to a fat girl her own daddy couldn't give away." He looked up. "Fenner, how fast can you have men on the Denver road?" "By morning. Then by morning." Crane folded the note and put it in his breast pocket over his heart, like something dear to him. "If the Thornton woman leaves that mountain with a satchel of my ledgers, headed for a federal office, she's not to reach it. You understand me? Whatever she's carrying, whatever's in her head, it never gets to Denver." Up the mountain, in the light of a single lamp, Eleanor Whitaker sat with the ledger open and a fresh sheet of paper beside it, and she began in a careful clerk's hand. Her dead mother would have known at a glance to write down every stolen dollar, one crooked line at a time. She had no idea a man had just given the order to make sure she never finished. She wrote until the lamp guttered, and when Caleb came to tell her it was past 2, he found her still at the desk with ink on her fingers and 40 pages of proof stacked square beside her. "You need to sleep," he said. "I need to finish." She didn't look up. "Every dollar, Caleb. Every quarter. I want it so plain a child could follow it. When I hand this to a federal man, I want him to look at one page and know." Caleb pulled a stool up beside her and sat, and for a while he just watched her work the scratch of the pen, the only sound. Then he said quiet, "They'll be watching the Denver road. You know that. Crane's not a man to leave a thing to hope." "I know." "Then how do you mean to get there?" Eleanor set down the pen. She'd been turning it over all night under the arithmetic, and the answer she'd come to scared her, but it was the only one that held. "You don't get there," she said. "You're the one he's watching. You leave this mountain with the satchel, they'll have you before the foothills. But nobody's watching me." She met his eyes. "I'm the fat girl her own daddy couldn't give away. Remember, Crane thinks I'm a thing he lost, not a woman with a plan. He won't put men on a woman he figures is hiding in a locked room, crying. Eleanor?" It was the first time he'd used just her name, and it stopped them both a half-second. "He said your name in the same breath as she never reaches Denver. Fenner as good as told us. You go down that road alone, you're the one thing he's most afraid of and least afraid to hurt. Then I don't go down the road." She turned back to the pages. "There's a stage that runs the north cut to Fairplay twice a week, and from Fairplay, a rail spur to Denver. Crane owns the freight road. He doesn't own the rail. A woman gets on a stage in Fairplay with a carpet bag, who's to say what's in it?" She squared the stack again. "I go over the mountain on foot to the north cut. Amos knows the way. It's a hard day's walk, but nobody watches it because nobody but a fool would try it." "Or a woman who's decided she's done being priced," Caleb said slowly. "Or that." He was quiet a long moment. "I don't like it. Sending you off alone with the one thing that could ruin him. You don't have to like it." She finally looked up at him, and something in her face had set hard as a courthouse step. "You just have to trust that I can do it. That's a different thing than liking it, and it's the thing I've wanted my whole life and never once been given. So give it to me, Caleb. Trust me to do the one thing I'm better at than any man in this territory." And Caleb Thornton, who had learned young to trust almost nobody who'd built a mountain alone, precisely so. He'd never have to hand his fate to another soul. Looked at her a long moment, and did the hardest thing he'd done in 20 years. "All right," he said. "Amos takes you to the north cut at first light. I'll ride the Denver road loud and slow with an empty satchel, give Crane's men something to chase." He stood. "Get 2 hours sleep. You'll need your legs." She got the 2 hours. She dreamed of her mother's hands in flour. They left before the sun, Amos ahead and Eleanor behind, with the pages sewn flat into the lining of a carpet bag, and they'd not gone 2 miles up the north trail before Amos stopped dead and put his hand out flat behind him. "Down," he breathed. She dropped. Below them on the trail, where no watcher should have been, 2 of Crane's men sat their horses across the only pass rifles across their saddles, patient as buzzards. "He watched the north cut too," Amos whispered. "Lord, he watched everything." Eleanor's heart slammed. She pressed herself to the cold ground and understood in a rush that near stopped her breath that she'd underestimated the man. Crane hadn't guessed she was clever and dismissed it. Crane had assumed she was clever because he was clever, and a clever man plans for a clever enemy. He'd sealed every road off the mountain before she'd finished her first page. "We go back," Amos said. "We think again." "No." The word came out of her before the fear could stop it. "We go back, and he's won a day, and I don't have days, Amos. I've got 3 weeks, and he's got the whole world. There's no thinking our way past a man who's already thought of everything." She was breathing hard, her mind racing over the trap, looking for the one thing a trap always leaves. He watched the roads because he's guarding the evidence. He's thinking about the pages. He's not thinking... She stopped. Her eyes went wide. Amos! He's not thinking about the original. The what? "These are my pages, my summary. But the proof, the real proof, it's not in my carpet bag. It's in his freight office. His own ledgers in his own hand, the actual bills. My pages just point to where the truth is. If a federal marshal walks into Crane's freight office with a warrant and opens his books, it's all right there, written by Crane's own clerks." She grabbed Amos's sleeve. "He's guarding the roads out. He never once thought to guard the road in." Amos stared at her. "You're saying don't run the evidence to Denver. Bring Denver to the evidence. I'm saying a man can't burn his own ledgers without admitting he's got something to burn. And the second he knows a marshal's coming, that's exactly what he'll do. And a rich man scrambling to burn his own books in front of witnesses convicts himself better than any page I could carry." Her mind was moving faster than her mouth now. "We don't need to reach Denver. We need to get one letter to Denver past the roads. A letter's a small thing. A letter fits in a boot. And the one road Crane forgot to watch. It is the one his own freight rides," Amos said, understanding dawning. "The mail. His own contract mail runs through Fairplay twice a week. He'd never stop his own mail. It'd tangle his own business. Post a letter to the federal land office in his own mail sack." Eleanor breathed. "And Josiah Crane carries the sword to his own neck and pays the postage." For the first time that morning, Amos smiled a hard, grim, delighted smile. "Girl," he said, "you are a dangerous thing to have made an enemy of." They didn't go back to the ranch. They couldn't risk being seen turning around. Amos knew a widow named Sledge who ran a way station on the Fairplay track and hated Crane on account of he'd foreclosed her husband into an early grave, and it was to the widow Sledge that they went. And it was from the widow Sledge's kitchen table that Eleanor Whitaker wrote the letter that would end Josiah Crane, 3 tight pages, laying out the fraud, the forced foreclosures, the pattern across the whole valley, addressed to the United States Land Office and the office of the circuit judge, with a plea that a marshal be sent to examine the freight ledgers before they could be destroyed. She sealed it. The widow Sledge's boy carried it to the Fairplay post and dropped it in the sack marked for the eastbound stage, Crane's stage, Crane's contract, Crane's own wheels, turning to carry his ruin toward the one man he couldn't buy. What Eleanor didn't know, bent over that kitchen table, was how close Caleb had already come to dying for the decoy. He'd ridden the Denver road slow and loud with the empty satchel like they'd planned, and Crane's men had taken the bait exactly as he'd hoped, and then it had gone wrong the way these things do. 2 of them had boxed him in a dry wash where the trail narrowed, and one had a rifle up before Caleb cleared the bend, and for one long second it had been a coin in the air whether Caleb Thornton lived to see another sunrise. "Where's the woman?" the rifleman had said. "Crane wants what she's carrying." "Woman's crying in a locked room where I left her," Caleb had answered. Easy his own hands well away from his belt, because a rifle at 10 feet doesn't leave a man his pride. "This here satchel's flour receipts and a Bible. You're welcome to it. But you shoot a rancher on a public road over an empty bag, and you best be sure Crane's paying you enough to run to Mexico, 'cause that's where you'll be living after." The 2 men had looked at each other. That was the thing about hired guns, they did the arithmetic same as anyone. They'd taken the satchel, found the flour receipts, and the Bible cursed him blue and let him go with a warning and a bruised jaw. Caleb had ridden home the long way with his heart still slamming, knowing the decoy had worked, knowing he'd bought Eleanor her clear road north, and knowing, too, that he'd nearly paid for it with everything. He never told her how close it came. Some kindnesses, he'd decided, are best done by pretending they cost nothing. And then there was nothing to do but get home before Crane learned the pass had been walked. Because if he found out Eleanor had gotten off that mountain at all, he'd know something had gotten past him, and a cornered man burns his books. They didn't make it home clean. They came down the back of the mountain at dusk and found the yard full of horses and light in every window of Caleb's house, and Eleanor's whole body went cold before she understood what she was seeing. Amos caught her arm and pulled her behind the woodshed. "That's not Crane's men," he said low. "That's Lord, that's the whole town." It was. It was a dozen of them. More the wagons Eleanor had grown up beside pulled up in Caleb's yard, and in the middle of them, standing on Caleb's own porch, like he owned it, was Josiah Crane. And beside Crane hat in his hands, head down, stood Harlan Whitaker, her father. Eleanor's stomach dropped through the earth. She heard Crane's voice carry across the yard, smooth and public pitched for the crowd. "And I understand your feelings, Thornton, I do. But the girl is a Whitaker, and her father here has had a change of heart. Says he was wronged. Says a man took advantage of his low moment and stole his daughter for a pittance. And the good people of Dust Creek agree that a girl belongs with her family." Crane spread his hands, reasonable, generous. "Now nobody wants trouble. You give the girl back to her father, and I'll even tear up that foreclosure notice. Call the whole thing square. What could be fairer than that?" And there it was, the trap inside the trap. Crane hadn't come to take the mountain by force. He'd come to make Caleb choose the girl or the land. Hand Eleanor over and keep the mountain. Keep Eleanor and lose everything. He'd dressed it in the language of a father's love and a town's decency, and every soul in that yard was nodding along because it let them be the good guys in a thing they'd started by putting a woman on a loading dock. Eleanor watched Caleb come out onto his own porch to face them, and she saw him understand it too, all in a second, and she saw the cost of it land on him. "Harlan," Caleb said, "look at me. Is that what you want? You want your daughter back." Harlan Whitaker wouldn't lift his head. "She's my blood," he mumbled. "A man's got a right to his blood. That's not what I asked. I asked what you want. Same question I asked in the square, and you didn't answer it then either." Caleb's voice was terribly gentle. "Did Crane pay you, Harlan? Or just forgive your note?" Harlan's silence was its own answer, and a murmur went through the crowd. "Both, I'd guess," Caleb said quietly. "He's real fond of paying a man to do the low thing and calling it the man's own idea. Now that's slander," Crane said pleasantly. "Thornton, you're cornered and you're grasping. The girl's not even here, is she? You've hidden her somewhere, which tells me you know good and well she doesn't belong to you." He turned to the crowd. "An honest man doesn't hide a thing he came by honest." And Eleanor crouched behind the woodshed with the truth sewn into a carpetbag and 3 pages already riding a stagecoach toward Crane's destruction, understood that this was the moment. Not Denver, not the marshal, whenever he came. This. The whole town in a yard, deciding once again what she was worth, with her father bought, and her defender cornered, and no one expecting her to have a single word to say about it. She had spent 25 years letting them decide. She stepped out from behind the woodshed. "He's not hiding me," she said. The whole yard turned. A dozen faces she'd known her whole life swung toward her, and she felt the old heat climb her neck, the old urge to shrink, to apologize, to make herself small enough to slip out of notice. She let it come. And then she let it go, and she walked out into the light of Caleb's yard with her chin up and her mother's voice in her ears. "Hold your head up, not one thing more than you let them take." And she stopped in the middle of them all, where they could see every inch of her. "Nobody's hiding me," she said again louder. "I walked off that mountain myself this morning, and I walked back myself tonight, and I did a thing today that not one of you would have believed a woman like me could do. So here I am. If you came to decide what I'm worth, then look at me while you do it. You didn't have the decency for that in the square. You all studied your boots. Do it to my face this time." Crane recovered first. "Miss Whitaker, your father's come to take you home. It's a family matter, and he is not my family." She didn't shout it. She said it flat and final, and it cut cleaner than a shout. A family doesn't stand you on a platform and sell you by the pound. My mother was my family, and she's dead, and she taught me two things before she went. She taught me my figures. She turned slow to face the crowd. And she taught me that I belonged to myself before anyone ever claimed me, before my father claimed me, before this town priced me, before Mr. Crane decided I was a thing he could win or lose. I belonged to myself, and no bill of sale, and no lien clause, and no rich man's lawyer ever changed that, because it was never his to change. Eleanor, her father said, and his voice broke on it. Eleanor, please. I got no house. I got nothing. Crane says if I bring you back, he'll what, Pa? She rounded on him, and for the first time in her life, she watched Harlan Whitaker flinch from his own daughter. Forgive your note. Give you money. The same money he stole from Caleb Thornton, one crooked freight bill at a time. The same way he stole the widow Sledge's farm, and how many others in this valley. A gasp went through the crowd. She'd said something true, something they half knew and never spoke. That's right. Look around you. How many of you owe him? How many of you lost a barn, a field, a son's inheritance, and told yourselves it was just bad luck, just hard times, just the way of things? It wasn't. It was him. He's been draining this whole valley dry the same way he drained Caleb a little more each season, a debt built on a lie, so it'd fall due right when he wanted your land. And you followed him up this mountain to help him do it to one more decent man over a woman you already threw away once. The yard had gone dead silent. That's a fine speech, Crane said, but something had changed in his voice, a tightness, a first thread of fear. A fine speech from a girl who can't prove a word of it. Can't I? Eleanor took a step toward him. Your freight ledgers, Mr. Crane, 3 years of them, in your own clerk's hands. Every overcharge, every padded bill, every dollar you stole written down in your own office because you never once imagined a person you'd wronged could read a column of figures. She smiled, and it was not a kind smile, and she watched him see it. I've read them. Every line, and a federal marshal is going to read them too. I mailed the request today. She let that land. In your mail sack, Mr. Crane, on your stage. Your own wheels are carrying it east right now. By the time you think to stop it, it'll be past fair play and out of your reach, and the one thing a marshal wants to see when he arrives is a man's untouched books. So you've got a choice tonight, same as you tried to give Caleb. You can leave those ledgers be and let a federal man find the truth in them. Or you can ride down that mountain and burn them. And every soul in this yard will have watched you go and known why. And there's no lawyer in the territory can make an innocent man torch his own records in the dark. For one long, terrible moment, nobody moved. And then Josiah Crane made the mistake that finished him. He'd built an empire on other men's fear and his own patience, and he'd never once in all his careful years been cornered by someone he'd dismissed. He wasn't ready for it. His control cracked just for a second, and it cracked in front of the whole town. Fenner, he snapped, get the girl, get whatever she's carrying, now. Dab Fenner and 2 men stepped toward Eleanor, hands going to their belts, and the whole crowd saw it. Saw a rich man order 3 armed men to lay hands on an unarmed woman in the middle of a yard. Saw the thing he really was, drop its mask for one clear instant. That was when Caleb moved. He came off the porch fast and put himself between Eleanor and Fenner, and there was a pistol in his hand, though nobody had seen him draw it, and it was not pointed at anyone. Only held loose and ready at his side, in a way that told every man there he knew how to use it, and hoped he wouldn't have to. Dab, Caleb said, easy as Sunday. You take one more step toward that woman, and you and me are going to have the conversation we've been putting off. In front of everybody. You want that. You want to be the man who drew on a rancher over a bought and paid for foreclosure with a preacher watching, 'cause I don't think Crane pays you enough for a rope. Fenner stopped. And Eleanor. Eleanor did the last thing anyone in that yard expected. She stepped up beside Caleb, not behind him, and from the folds of her skirt, she brought out the small pistol Caleb had taught her to load and fire in the long evenings on the mountain, when she'd asked him quiet and ashamed to show her how a woman might protect herself just once in her life. She didn't point it either. She held it the way he held his loose, ready plane. "I've stood behind men my whole life," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of that silent yard. "Behind my father while he sold me, behind this town while it laughed. I'm done standing behind anybody." She looked at Crane. "You sent 3 men to take a thing off a woman. Here I am. Come take it." Nobody came. The crowd had turned. Eleanor felt it turn the way you feel weather change, a stirring, a muttering, a shifting of feet. These were not evil people. They were weak and frightened, and long bullied, and they'd followed Crane up the mountain, the way frightened people follow the loudest man. But now, they'd watched a rich man they all secretly hated order violence against a woman they'd all secretly pitied, and they'd heard that woman name the debts that had ground their own lives down. And something in the arithmetic of the crowd had shifted. "He took my North 40, a man said suddenly from the back. Old Pruitt, Tom's uncle, Mrs. Pruitt's husband. 2 years back, said I'd fell behind. I never fell behind. I paid every quarter." His voice shook. "Girl's right. He padded my accounts. I always knew it, and I never had the sand to say it." "He took my Daniel's inheritance," a woman said. "The whole east pasture. He took—" It came apart all at once, the way a dam goes, not gradual, but all in a rush once the first stone gives. Voice after voice, debt after debt, a whole valley's worth of quiet ruin. Finding words in Caleb Thornton's yard, and Josiah Crane stood on the porch and watched his kingdom of fear dissolve in front of him. Because the one thing that held it together was that no one ever said the true thing out loud, and a fat girl her own father couldn't sell had just said it to his face. "You're all fools," Crane said, and his voice had gone ugly now, stripped of its smooth. "Every debt I hold is legal, signed, witnessed. You think a federal marshal cares about your feelings? I'll have my land and my note and this mountain besides, and the lot of you will still owe me come winter, and you'll remember the night you turned on the one man who—" "The night we turned on you," Eleanor said quietly, "is the night you sent 3 men to take a woman in front of your own preacher. That's the part they'll remember, Mr. Crane. Not your legal notes. That." She let the pistol drop back into her skirts. "You've been careful your whole life. 20 years of never once showing your hand. And you just showed it to a whole town over me, over the $50 girl." A short, wondering breath left her. "My father priced me wrong. This whole town priced me wrong. But you priced me wrongest of all. Because you're the only one who was ever afraid of me, and you were right to be." Crane's face was working. He looked at the crowd, his crowd that had been his crowd an hour ago, and he saw it was not his anymore. He looked at Fenner, who would not meet his eye. Now a hired man reading the wind. He looked at Harlan Whitaker, weeping openly by the porch rail, and at Caleb Thornton standing armed and easy between him and the girl, and last of all, he looked at Eleanor. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It finishes when the marshal opens your books. This is just the night you found out it was going to." Crane came down off the porch. The crowd parted for him, but slow and grudging, and a few of them didn't part at all, so that he had to turn his shoulder to pass. He mounted his horse. He looked back once at the yard full of people who'd stopped being afraid of him, and whatever he saw there put the first true fear Eleanor had ever witnessed into Josiah Crane's eyes. "Fenner," he said. "We're going." And Dab Fenner, hired man too. The Bone looked at his cornered employer and looked at the armed rancher and the turned crowd, and made the only calculation a hired man ever really makes. "No," Fenner said. "I don't believe I am. I signed on to lean on debtors, Crane. I didn't sign on to hang for grabbing a woman in front of 40 witnesses." He stepped his horse back. "You're on your own tonight." Crane stared at him. Then he wheeled his horse and rode down the mountain alone into the dark. A man who'd walked into a yard with a whole town at his back and rode out of it with no one at all. The silence he left behind was enormous. Eleanor stood in the middle of it, shaking now that it was over, the strength that had held her upright, draining out through her feet. Caleb's hand found her elbow, steadying, not grasping the way it had at the platform a lifetime ago, and she leaned into it, just barely, just enough. "You all right?" he said low, just for her. "No," she said honestly. "But I will be." She looked up at him. Was that Eleanor?" He said her name like it was the answer to something. "I have never in my life seen anything like what you just did. Not once. Not in any war I fought, or any town I passed through." He shook his head slow. "You walked into a yard full of people who broke you, and you didn't just stand up to them. You woke them up. Half this valley's going to sleep tonight knowing something they've spent years pretending they didn't. You did that. Fat girl in an old dress." His voice roughened. "God almighty, woman. They priced you at $50. Across the yard, Harlan Whitaker had sunk down onto the porch step, his face in his hands, and the townspeople were drifting to him and away from him, both unsure now what to do with a man who'd sold his daughter to a monster and lived to watch her defeat him. Eleanor looked at her father a long moment. She did not forgive him. She wasn't ready, and she wasn't sure she'd ever be, and she'd stopped believing she owed anyone forgiveness they hadn't earned. But she crossed the yard and she crouched down in front of him, and she made him lift his head and look at her. "You'll get no house from me, Pa," she said, "and no money and no lie about how it's all forgot. But you're going to do one thing before you go. When the marshal comes, you're going to tell him the truth. All of it. What Crane paid you. What he promised you. How he moves. You know things about that man nobody else does, and you're going to hand every one of them over and it won't buy back what you did to me. But it's the one thing left you can do that isn't cowardly." She stood. "That's not a daughter asking. That's a witness telling you what's coming. You can meet it like a man, or you can run, but I'd think long and hard, Pa. You've run from every hard thing in your life. Look where it's left you." Harlan Whitaker looked up at his daughter and something moved in his ruined face. Not redemption, not yet, but the first raw beginning of a man deciding to stop being a coward at the very end of his rope. "I'll tell him," he whispered. "God help me. I'll tell him everything." Eleanor turned away from him, back toward Caleb, back toward the house, with the door that locked from the inside, and the key that was hers. The crowd was breaking up now, wagons pulling out, voices low and shaken, a whole town going home to lie awake with what they'd seen. Tom Pruitt came running up to her out of the dark, his young face shining, and blurted, "Ma'am, that was the bravest thing I ever—" before his uncle called him back. And Amos, who had watched the whole of it from the shadow of the woodshed with a rifle across his arms that he'd never once had to raise, came and stood beside Caleb, and the three of them looked out over the emptying yard. "He'll not give up," Amos said quietly. "Man like that. He's got money left, and money buys lawyers, and lawyers buy time. This ain't over on account of he rode off alone." "No," Caleb agreed. "But it's turned," Eleanor said. She was still shaking, and Caleb's steadying hand was still at her elbow, and 3 pages of proof were riding a stagecoach east through the dark toward the one man Josiah Crane could not buy. "It's turned, Amos. He came up this mountain to make Caleb choose between me and the land. And he rode down it, having lost the whole valley's fear in one night over the one person he never should have been afraid to lose." She let out a long, unsteady breath. "Let him buy his lawyers. I've got his own books, his own words, his own mail sack, and a town that finally said out loud what he did to them. He spent 20 years making everyone too scared to add up what he was stealing." She looked up at Caleb, and for the first time since a stranger had asked a shocking question in a dusty square, Eleanor Whitaker smiled without a single thing held back. "He forgot," she said, "that I was always good at adding." The marshal did not come the next day, nor the day after, and every hour he didn't come was an hour Josiah Crane had to think. Eleanor felt the waiting in her teeth. She kept the ledger copies in the locked room and slept lighter than she wanted to admit, and she watched the mountain road, the way a farmer watches a storm front, knowing it was out there building and not knowing which way it would break. Caleb rode the fence lines with a rifle now, Not because he expected an army, but because a cornered rich man does his worst work quiet. Amos took to sleeping in the barn with the door cracked. Even Tom, when he came up, kept looking over his shoulder like the trees had gone untrustworthy. "He's not sitting still down there," Caleb said on the third evening. "I know that man. He's spending money right now. Question is on what?" The answer came on the fourth day, and it was worse than any of them had feared. A rider came up. Not one of Crane's, a boy from Fairplay with a message and a scared face. And the message was this: the eastbound stage carrying Eleanor's letter had been stopped outside Fairplay. Robbed, the story said. Mail sack cut open, a few valuables taken, the driver roughed but alive. Just a road agent, the sheriff was calling it. Just bad luck. Eleanor read the note twice and felt the bottom drop out of her. "He stopped his own mail," she whispered. "He robbed his own stage to kill one letter. I said he'd never do it because it'd tangle his business, and he did it anyway because I didn't count on how scared he'd get." She pressed the note flat on the table with a shaking hand. "The letter's gone, Caleb. Denver never got it. Nobody's coming." The kitchen went very quiet. "Then we write another," Amos said. "He'll stop every letter now, every stage, every rider. He knows what we're doing." Eleanor's mind was racing, and for the first time since the yard, it was racing toward a wall. He bought himself time, and he'll spend it burning those ledgers. By the time we get word to Denver, any other way there'll be nothing for a marshal to find. Just my word, and a fat girl's word against a rich man's isn't worth the paper. Stop. Caleb said it sharp, and she did. He came and sat across from her and put both hands flat on the table. "You listen to me. You spent your whole life letting one bad hour convince you the whole game was lost. That's the old Eleanor talking, the one who stood on a platform and let them price her. I've watched you these past weeks. You don't quit when a thing goes wrong. You find the thing the other fellow forgot, so find it." His eyes held hers. "What did Crane forget?" Eleanor breathed. She made herself stop staring at the wall and start looking at the board. And then she saw it. "The receipts," she said slowly. "What receipts?" "His freight bills. Every time Crane overcharged a customer, he handed that customer a bill, a receipt, in his own office's hand." She stood up so fast the chair scraped. "He can burn his own ledgers, Caleb, but he can't burn the copies he gave to every farmer in this valley. The proof isn't only in Crane's office. It's in 100 kitchen drawers all across Dust Creek. Every man he cheated is holding a piece of the truth and doesn't even know it." She turned to Amos. "How many of those people were in this yard the other night? How many stood there and finally said out loud that he robbed them?" Amos's weathered face changed. "Near all of them." "Then we don't need Crane's books at all." Eleanor's voice was climbing. "We need everyone he ever cheated to open a drawer and bring us what they were charged. One bill's a grievance. 100 bills laid side by side, all climbing the same crooked way, all in the same office's hand. That's a pattern no lawyer alive can call bad luck. That's fraud a blind judge could see." She pressed her hand to her mouth. "He robbed his own stage to stop one letter. He never once thought the letters he needed to worry about were the ones he'd already handed out himself years ago with his own name on them." Caleb was already standing. "I'll ride the valley tonight." "We'll all ride the valley tonight," Eleanor said. "And so will they once they understand. A town that's scared of a man will do nothing, but a town that's found out it's not alone in the wrong done to it." She thought of the dam breaking in the yard, voice after voice. That's a different animal entirely. They rode out under the dark, the four of them splitting the valley between them and Eleanor. Whitaker knocked on doors that had laughed at her a month before. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than the yard, harder than the platform, because at least in the yard, the anger had carried her. Now she had to stand on the porches of people who'd priced her and ask them to trust her, and the first 3 doors nearly broke her. "You've got nerve," said the first man, "coming here after you watched my father sell me and said nothing." Eleanor didn't drop her eyes. "I do have nerve. I found it about a week ago, Now you can slam that door and keep being a man who lets a thief bleed him dry because he's too proud to take help from the girl he laughed at. Or you can go to your wife's drawer and bring me every freight bill you ever paid and be part of the thing that finally ends him." She waited. "Your choice, but you make it to my face this time." The man stared at her a long moment. Then he called back into the house. "Martha, get the box off the mantel. All of it." After that, it got easier, the way a thing gets easier once the first stone gives. Word ran ahead of her faster than her horse. By the time she reached the widow Sledges, who'd already heard who was already waiting with a whole crate of her dead husband's papers, half the valley knew what Eleanor Whitaker was collecting and why. They came to her after that. She didn't have to knock. They came up the mountain road with bundles tied in string and cigar boxes soft at the corners and old bills gone yellow, and they set them on Caleb Thornton's table, and they said one after another some version of the same broken thing I always knew. I always knew, and I never said. Make him pay. It took Eleanor 9 days to sort it. 9 days at the desk by the window, with the whole valley's grievance spread out in front of her. And she built from it a thing more damning than any letter, a full accounting of Josiah Crane's fraud farm by farm, year by year, drawn not from his books, but from his own victims' hands, every crooked dollar traced and named and totaled. When she finished, she had a stack of proof a foot high, and a summary so clean and so plain that when she read it aloud to Caleb and Amos at the table, Amos took off his hat like he was in church. "That'll hang him," Amos said quietly. "That'll do better than hang him," Eleanor said. "It'll give the whole valley back what he took. Every voided debt, every stolen acre. It's all in here." She squared the stack. "Now we just have to put it in front of a man he can't buy, and this time we don't trust it to a stage." They didn't. Caleb himself rode it to Denver the long way over 3 days of hard country sleeping cold, and off the roads, carrying the foot-high proof in his saddlebags. And Eleanor did not breathe easy for 1 minute of the 6 days he was gone. On the third night, Tom Pruitt came pounding up the mountain to say men had been seen asking after Thornton on the Denver road, and Eleanor spent that night at the window with her mother's voice in her ears, and her hands wrapped white around a coffee cup. And she prayed, which she hadn't done since her mother died, and she was not too proud to admit it. He came home on the 6th day gaunt and saddle-sore and alive, and he swung down in the yard, and Eleanor was across it, before she knew she'd moved, and she stopped herself a foot short of him, with her hands twisting. Because she didn't have the right. She told herself she didn't have the right to. "It's done," Caleb said. "I got it to the federal land office my own self. Put it in the hands of a deputy marshal named Coyne, a hard man, government to the bone, hates a land fraud worse than sin." He was grinning through the exhaustion. He read your summary standing up in the office and didn't sit down till he'd read the whole foot of it. Then he said, Caleb's voice caught, and Eleanor understood there was more feeling in this man than he'd ever once let show. He said, "Whoever put this together ought to be a federal auditor. This is the cleanest fraud case I've seen cross this desk in 10 years. He looked at her. "A federal man said that. About your work. The town priced you at $50, Eleanor, and a United States deputy marshal wants to know your name." She didn't have any words. She'd been braced her whole life for the world to tell her what she was worth, and it had always been low, always been a joke, always been $50 and a bad dress. And now the world was saying something else, and she found she had no armor built for kindness, no place to put it, and it undid her, the way the biscuits had, the way the unlocked door had. "Marshall's coming," Caleb said, gentle, watching her face. 2 weeks, maybe less. He's bringing the circuit judge and a writ to seize Crane's books before Crane can finish burning them. And when he opens that freight office—" He shook his head. "Your bills'll match what's left of his ledgers line for line. There'll be no wriggling out, not this time." But Josiah Crane was not a man who waited to be seized. Word came up the mountain the very evening before the marshal was due. Crane had called in every debt in the valley at once, all of them in a single desperate stroke. Foreclosure notices nailed to 40 gateposts overnight. A last mad grab to turn as much of the valley into cash and property as he could before the government arrived to freeze it all. He'd bribed the local sheriff to serve every paper by dawn. If he could make himself owner of half the valley before the marshal rode in, he reckoned then it wasn't fraud they'd be untangling anymore. It'd be 100 separate lawful foreclosures. A mess so big and so tangled, a federal court might take years to sort it. And years was all a rich man ever needed. "He's trying to make the theft too big to stop," Eleanor breathed, reading the notice Tom had torn off the widow Sledge's gate. 40 families put out of their homes by sunup. That's his play. Drown the whole thing in ink and hope the judge chokes on it. "The sheriff serves those papers at dawn," Amos said grimly. "Ain't nothing says he can't. Crane owns him. Then we stop the dawn." Eleanor was already moving. "Ride the valley. Every family Crane's serving tonight, tell them one thing. Don't sign. Don't leave. Don't accept service. Not one of them. If 40 families stand on their own porches at dawn and refuse a bought sheriff's papers altogether, that's not 40 foreclosures. That's a whole valley in open revolt against a fraud, and a federal marshal riding in at that exact hour is going to see plain as day which side of it he's on." "They're scared, Eleanor," Caleb said quietly. "Scared people don't stand together. That's how he's held them 20 years. They stood in your yard." Eleanor met his eyes. "They found their voices in your yard the other night all at once over me. They can find their feet at dawn the same way. It only takes one house refusing before the second one finds the nerve." She pulled her shawl on. "I'll take the first house myself. I'll take the hardest one. And when the sheriff comes to serve the widow Sledge, he's going to find me standing on her porch and the widow beside me, and I'll read that bought lawman his own boss's fraud out loud off my summary until he's too ashamed to hand her a paper. Then we move to the next porch, and the next." She did exactly that. The dawn Josiah Crane had planned to be his triumph became the strangest morning Dust Creek ever saw. The sheriff rode out with his fistful of papers and his hired deputies and found at the first house a fat woman in a navy dress standing on the porch steps with a foot-high stack of proof in her arms, and the whole family lined up behind her, and she would not move, and she would not stop reading. And by the time the sheriff had argued and threatened and gotten exactly nowhere, half the valley had heard. He was out serving papers and had come to watch, and a bought man cannot do his buying in front of a crowd that stopped being afraid. House after house it went the same. Eleanor moving ahead of the sheriff, the crowd swelling behind her. 40 families refusing service on their own porches, until the sheriff's sweating horse, undone, threw his papers in the dirt outside the 5th house and said he'd not lose his neck for Josiah Crane's greed, and rode off. And the whole valley let out a roar that Eleanor Whitaker would hear in her good dreams the rest of her life. That was the hour Deputy Marshal Coyne rode into Dust Creek. He was everything Caleb had promised, hard-faced, unhurried government to the bone. And he rode in with the circuit judge beside him and a writ in his saddlebag, and found a whole town standing in the street in the wreckage of a foreclosure that had failed. He listened. He read Eleanor's summary a second time sitting his horse. And then Deputy Marshal Coyne looked down at the woman who'd written it and said the words that ended Josiah Crane. "Ma'am, take me to that freight office and bring your bills." They found Crane there. Of course they did. He was in the back with a fire going in a barrel and half his ledgers already curling to ash. And when the marshal walked in, Crane straightened up with a burned page in his own hand, and there was no lawyer on earth could talk his way out of what 40 witnesses watched him doing. "You're burning your own books, Mr. Crane," Coyne said mildly. "The same hour a federal officer arrives to read them. A man might wonder why an innocent fellow do that." "I don't have to explain my—" "No, you don't." Coyne nodded to his men. "But you're going to." He looked at the barrel at the ash at the ledgers not yet burned. "And it don't matter anyhow. This lady's already rebuilt your fraud out of the receipts you handed your victims. You could have burned every book you own and she'd still have you cold. You spent 20 years, Mr. Crane, making sure nobody in this valley could read a column of figures." Coyne almost smiled. "Should have checked the girl your friend Whitaker put up for sale." Crane's eyes found Eleanor across the smoke. She did not flinch from him. She'd flinched from him once in a yard when the cold went all the way down to her feet. She didn't flinch now. She stood in the doorway of his ruined kingdom, with a foot of his own crimes in her arms, and she looked Josiah Crane full in the face. "You asked me once what I could prove," she said quietly. "Now you know." They took him out in irons. The whole town watched silent, and it was not a gloating silence. It was heavier than that, the silence of people watching. A fear that had shaped their whole lives, be led away in chains, and hardly able to believe it could be led away at all. Harlan Whitaker was in that crowd. He'd come down off whatever ledge he'd been living on sober for once, and when Deputy Marshal Coyne asked in the square who among them would swear to what Crane had done, it was Harlan who stepped forward first. Harlan Whitaker, who'd sold his own daughter on that very spot a month before. "I will," Harlan said, and his voice shook, but it held. "I'll swear to all of it. He paid me to take my girl back so he could squeeze Thornton off his mountain. He's been paying men to do his dirt for years and calling it their own idea." He turned then to Eleanor in front of the whole town in the same square where he'd priced her. "I did a wicked thing to you, girl. Wickedest thing a father can do. I can't unmake it. But I can stand here and tell the truth for once in my sorry life, and I can tell these people what my daughter is. She's the only one of us with the sand to stand up to that man. The only one. And I sold her for $50. His face crumpled. "God forgive me. I sold the best of us for $50. Eleanor looked at her father a long moment. She did not run to him. She did not say it was all right because it wasn't, and she'd learned to stop lying to make broken men feel better. But she crossed the square, and she took his shaking hand in both of hers, and she said so only he could hear. "Testify true, Pa. Every word. That's your road back." "Not to me. I don't know if there's a road back to me, but to yourself. Take it." And she let go of his hand, and she left him standing there weeping in the square, a man beginning the long work of becoming someone he could live with. The circuit judge held the hearing that same week in the church because it was the only building big enough, and half the territory tried to crowd in. Crane's lawyer, the fine, expensive, forked-tongue lawyer, stood up to argue the debts were lawful and the foreclosures legitimate, and Eleanor Whitaker took the stand against him. She had never in her life spoken in front of more than a supper table. Her hands shook when she rose. And then she opened her summary, and she started to read the numbers, and something happened that she would never fully be able to explain. The numbers steadied her. The figures didn't care that she was fat, or poor, or a woman, or a girl her father couldn't sell. The figures were just true, and she knew them cold, and she laid them out one after another with a clarity that turned the whole church silent. Crane's lawyer tried to rattle her. "And what qualifies you, Miss Whitaker, a woman with no schooling and no standing, to accuse a respected businessman of—" "My mother qualified me," Eleanor said. "She taught me figures when I was 8 because she knew a woman who couldn't cipher would spend her whole life at the mercy of men who could. She was right." Eleanor turned a page. "Now, you represent Mr. Crane, so you'll have seen his freight rates. Explain to this court, sir, how 40 pounds of nails cost a man $1 in the spring of '75 and $1.60 by the fall of '77, when the price of nails in Denver over that same stretch fell. Explain it." "I'll wait." She looked up at him, calm as still water. "I've got 100 more like it. We can go through them all. I brought lunch." The church laughed. The lawyer did not have an answer. He never got one because there wasn't one, because a fraud is a fraud, and no amount of fine schooling can make crooked numbers run straight. And then came the blow that broke Crane's defense entirely. On the second day, Deputy Marshal Coyne called Dab Fenner to the stand. Fenner, the hired man who'd ridden up the mountain to threaten Caleb, who'd stepped his horse back in the yard when his employer showed his true face. He came in with his hat in his hands and no love left for the man who'd paid him, and he told the whole church how it worked from the inside. "He'd have me pad the freight bills quarter by quarter," Fenner said, staring at his own boots. "Told me to keep it small. Said a man'll notice a big theft and shrug at 100 little ones. He'd build a debt on a farmer that way for years, then call it due the season the farmer couldn't pay, and take the land at a court he owned." He swallowed. "I did it because I was afraid of him, same as everybody. Then I watched him send 3 men to grab a woman off a rancher's porch in front of a preacher. And I got to thinking, there wasn't a wage worth being that man's dog. He looked up once at Eleanor. She's the one who wasn't afraid. First one I ever saw. I reckon that's why she won. Crane's lawyer had no cross for that. There was nothing left to ask. It was over in 3 days. Josiah Crane was bound over for federal trial on charges that would keep him in irons for the rest of his natural life. Every debt he held in the valley was frozen pending review, and the ones Eleanor could prove were built on fraud, which was near all of them. The judge voided from the bench, one after another, 40 families worth of ruin wiped clean in an afternoon. The widow Sledge got her husband's farm back. Old Pruitt got his North 40. And Caleb Thornton's $400 note, the crooked debt Crane had spent 3 years building brick by brick to steal a mountain, the judge tore it up in open court and ordered Crane's estate to repay every dollar of the overcharge besides. The mountain was safe. Eleanor learned it standing at the back of the church, and she didn't cheer with the rest of them. She went very still, and Caleb found her there, and he didn't say anything for a while. He just stood beside her. "It's yours again," she said finally. "Free and clear. Nobody can take it now." "It's ours," Caleb said. She looked at him. "I didn't mean—" He stopped and turned his hat in his hands, and Eleanor realized with a small shock that this hard, calm man was nervous, that she'd never once seen him nervous, not with 3 armed men in his yard, or a rifle in a dry wash. And here he was, turning his hat like a boy. "I've been thinking on something. On the ride to Denver and back mostly. 3 days out, and 3 days home with nothing but a horse and my own fool head for company." He cleared his throat. "You asked me once that first morning in the kitchen why I went up that mountain. Why I built the whole thing alone 40 acres at a time so far from anybody. I told you it was to get away. To be shut of a world that had sold me once and never came to help." He looked at her. "That was true when I said it. It's the truest thing about me, or it was. But I've been up on that mountain 20 years. Eleanor and I want to tell you what I figured out somewhere on the Denver road." "What?" "I wasn't hiding up there." His voice was rough. "I was waiting. I just didn't know it. I built a house too big for one man, and a table with more chairs than I ever had guests, and I told myself it was foolishness, and it wasn't. Some part of me was building a place for somebody I hadn't met yet. Somebody who'd need what I had, a locked door, a spot at the table, a chance to find out what they were worth, without a soul trying to take it from them." He shook his head, slow, wondering at himself. "I didn't go up the mountain to get away from the world. I went up to have something worth coming back down for. I just had to wait 20 years and pay $60 in a dusty square before I understood it." Eleanor could not breathe. "I'm not asking you for anything," Caleb said quickly, seeing her face. "I mean that. There's no bill coming, remember. There never was. You can stay on that mountain the rest of your life as my friend, and my bookkeeper, and the finest mind in the territory. And I'll be glad of it, and ask for nothing more. I need you to know that's true before I say the other thing, because I don't ever want you to feel you owe Caleb, me, a single thing on account of what you've been through, and I couldn't stand it if you thought, Caleb." She was almost laughing now, and almost crying, and she'd never in her life felt both so hard at once and welcomed it. For a man who says so little, you surely can go on. He shut his mouth. "Say the other thing," Eleanor said. Caleb Thornton looked at the woman. A whole town had priced at $50, the woman who'd walked off a loading dock and up a mountain and taken down the man who ruled a valley, and he said the other thing. "I'd like it," he said, "if you'd let me court you. Proper. Slow as you need. No hurry, no pushing, and the door stays yours and locks from the inside same as always, till such a day, if it ever comes, and no shame if it don't, you decide you'd rather it didn't need to." He turned the hat one more time. "I've loved you a while now, I think. Somewhere between the biscuits and the ledgers. I just didn't have the sense to know it till a federal marshal told me your work was the finest he'd seen, and I felt prouder than any man's got a right to feel about a thing that isn't his." Eleanor Whitaker stood in the back of a church full of a valley she'd saved, and she looked at the first man who'd ever asked her what she wanted, and she gave him her answer. "Slow," she said, "and the door stays mine." The door stays yours. Always. Then yes. Her voice broke on it, the good kind of break, the kind she'd never known before. Yes, Caleb. You can court me. Slow as the seasons. But I'll tell you now so you're not surprised later. And here she smiled at him, wet-eyed and unafraid. I don't intend to make it take too long. I've spent 25 years being told what I'm worth by people who were wrong about every bit of it. I'm not going to spend a single extra day pretending I don't know a good thing when I've fought a whole valley to keep it. They rode back up the mountain together that evening side by side. Now no careful foot of air between them, and Eleanor did not once look back at the town. She had a life to build, and for the first time in all her days, it was going to be one she chose. It didn't take long for the mountain to fill with people the world had thrown away. Word had a way of traveling about a place where a discarded woman had made herself a home, and they came the way she'd once come. Quiet braced for the catch, waiting for the demand that never arrived. A girl who'd run from a husband who used his fists. A widow with 3 children and no man, and a town that had no use for her. A boy nobody wanted, and then another. Eleanor took them in the way she'd been taken in, and she showed each one the same thing first, a door that locked from the inside and a key, and the words she'd once been unable to believe. You don't have to earn your right to exist. She started a small school in the front room, teaching letters and figures because her mother had been right. A woman who could cipher was never wholly at any man's mercy, and Eleanor Whitaker meant to put that armor on every woman who climbed her mountain. She planted a garden that fed twice as many as it should have. She kept the ranch's books so clean, Deputy Marshal Coyne wrote to ask, only half joking, whether she'd take a federal post. She wrote back that she had a better one, thank you, and it came with a mountain and a garden and a man who'd asked her a question in a dusty square when nobody else would even meet her eye. And on the evenings when the work was done and the people she'd gathered were fed and safe behind doors that locked from the inside, Eleanor and Caleb would sit on the porch, slow as the seasons, and say very little in the comfortable way of 2 people who'd both been thrown away once and had found on a hard mountain in the middle of nowhere that the thing the world discards is sometimes the very thing that was worth the most all along. The courting went slow as she'd asked, and then the way true things do it stopped feeling slow at all. By the time the first snow came and melted, and the garden woke a second time, Eleanor Whitaker had stopped locking her door at night, not because anyone made her, but because one morning she'd simply noticed the key had hung on its nail for a month, and she'd slept fine, and she'd left it there. Caleb never once mentioned it. That was his way. He'd learned early that the surest way to send a wounded thing back into hiding was to point at the moment it stepped into the light. They were to be married at the summer's turn. And the mountain that had held one lonely man for 20 years now held more souls than Eleanor could count. On both hands, the girl who'd run from a husband's fists, gone quiet and healing. The widow with 3 children teaching the little ones their letters right alongside Eleanor now. 2 boys nobody had wanted grown brown and loud and unafraid, and more coming every month following the strange rumor that ran through the low places of the territory. There's a woman on a mountain in Colorado who'll take you in and ask you for nothing. She had become without ever meaning to the very thing she'd once needed and never had. She should have known Josiah Crane wouldn't let her have it clean. The writer came up on a Tuesday, and Eleanor knew before he opened his mouth that the piece was over because she'd learned to read a scared face at 40 paces. It was the widow Sledge's boy again, older now and breathless from the climb. "Miss Eleanor," he gasped. "You gotta come down. Crane's lawyer's back. There's a new one, a Denver man fancy, and he's filed papers at the land office, and folks are saying—" He swallowed. "Folks are saying it's about your mountain, about this place. He's coming for the refuge." The kitchen, full of women and children a moment before, went still. Eleanor set down the bowl she was holding. "Crane's in a federal jail awaiting trial. He's got nothing left. The debts were voided. What could he possibly—" "That's the thing, ma'am." The boy's voice dropped. "The Denver lawyer's not arguing the debts. He's saying the title's bad, says the deed. Mr. Thornton's held all these years to the whole mountain, says it was never filed proper at the land office. Says there's no legal record Mr. Thornton ever owned it at all. and a mountain nobody legally owns. Reverts to whoever files a claim on it first." Eleanor finished, and the cold went down to her feet the way it had in Caleb's yard a year before. She found Caleb in the barn and told him. And she watched a thing happen to his face she'd only seen once. The gray under the tan, the old fear folded down small and put away. But it was there. Because this was the one thing that could still take everything. "The deed," she said. "You filed it. You must have filed it. 20 years ago when you bought the first 40. I filed it." Caleb's jaw was tight. "I rode 2 days to the Territorial Land Office and I filed it my own self 40 acres at a time every parcel over 20 years. I've got the receipts. I've got the—" He stopped. "Eleanor, I've got the receipts. But the land office keeps the master record, the official filing. If a man wanted to steal a mountain and he owned somebody at that office, he could make the master record disappear." Eleanor breathed. "Your receipts say you filed. But if the official book shows no record, a court believes the book, not the rancher's scraps of paper." She pressed her hand to her mouth. "That's why Crane always won. It's not just that he padded bills. He had a man inside the land office. Somebody who could lose a deed, misfile a claim, make the paper say whatever Crane needed it to say. That's the machine underneath the whole thing. That's how one man drained a whole valley for 20 years and never once got caught until a girl started reading his freight bills." Caleb looked at her. "You're saying Crane's got a partner in the government. I'm saying a fraud this big doesn't run on one man." Her mind was moving fast and hard now, the way it did the fear burning off into something colder and clearer. Crane was the face, the money. But somebody with a government seal has been protecting him losing the right papers, filing the wrong claims, making sure every foreclosure held up in a court that should have thrown it out. And now that Crane's in irons and the debts are voided and the whole valley's watching, that partner's got one last card to play. Take the mountain. Take the refuge. Punish the woman who exposed them, and get back the one piece of land Crane wanted most, all in a single stroke, dressed up legal as a Sunday caller. She dropped her hand. "It's not over, Caleb. We only cut off the head. The body's still moving. And it's coming for the one place I've built." For a moment, Caleb Thornton looked older than she'd ever seen him. Then Eleanor did the thing she'd learned to do in the years since a stranger asked her what she wanted. She squared her shoulders, and she lifted her chin, and she stopped being afraid out loud. "Get Amos," she said, "and send for Deputy Marshal Coyne. He hates a land fraud worse than sin, remember." "Well, I'm about to hand him one with a government seal on it." She was already moving toward the desk by the window, where a year of the refuge's clean, careful books sat squared and waiting. "Crane thought I'd stop at his freight bills. This new man thinks I'll be too scared or too grateful for my little mountain to look under the last rock. They're both about to learn the same lesson." She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. You don't threaten a woman's home and expect her to stop counting. Finding the partner took her 11 days, and it near broke her before it broke him. She started with Caleb's filing receipts, 20 years of them, and against each one, she needed the matching entry in the Territorial Land Office's master record. And the master record, of course, was the very thing she couldn't see, because it lived in the office of the man she was hunting. So she did what she'd done before. She went sideways. She went to the victims. Because a land office doesn't only serve one rancher. Every filing, every claim, every foreclosure in the valley had passed through that same office and that same official's hands for 20 years, and every one of them had left a trail somewhere. A copy in a farmer's drawer, a notice in the county paper, a record with the circuit court that the land office couldn't reach to alter. Eleanor gathered them the way she'd gathered the freight bills, and she laid them side by side, and she looked for the pattern, and the pattern was there, as ugly and clear as the freight ledgers had been. Every single foreclosure Crane had ever won. Every claim that had ever gone his way. Every deed that had ever mysteriously vanished when a debtor tried to prove ownership, all of it had passed under one signature. One name appearing again and again across 20 years of quiet ruin. The Territorial Land Commissioner. A man named Ezra Vance. The very official whose office was now filing the claim that Caleb Thornton's mountain had never been legally his. He signed his own crimes. Eleanor said when she laid it out for coin at the church, the whole foot-high proof of it stacked on the altar rail. For 20 years. He thought no one would ever put it together because no one ever had reason to gather papers from 100 different drawers and read them all at once. Crane bled the valley, and Vance covered the tracks, and between them they owned the money and the law both, and there was no daylight between them anywhere a normal man could reach. She set her hand flat on the stack. "But I'm not a normal man, Marshall. I'm a woman my own father couldn't sell for $50, and I've got nothing better to do with my life than add up exactly what these two stole. So, here it is. Every dollar, every acre, every lost deed traced to the same hand. You wanted a land fraud with a government seal on it." She almost smiled. "I brought you the seal." Deputy Marshal Coyne read it standing up the way he'd read her first summary, and when he finished, he was quiet a long moment. "Miss Whitaker," he said finally, "I've served this territory 11 years. I always figured somebody upstairs was dirty. Everybody figured it. Nobody could ever prove it because you can't prove a thing about the men who keep the records, they just change the records." He looked at the stack like it was something holy. "You didn't go at the records. You went around them. You rebuilt the whole truth out of the pieces he couldn't reach." He shook his head slow. "There's federal auditors in Denver couldn't have done this. And you did it in a farmhouse in 11 days defending your own home." "I had motivation," Eleanor said. But even as Coyne rode for Denver with the proof of Ezra Vance's 20 years of fraud, Vance made his move because a cornered man with a government seal is more dangerous than a cornered man with only money. He didn't send hired guns this time. He sent the law. Vance had the territorial court issue an eviction lawful on its face, stamped and sealed ordering every soul off the unowned mountain within 3 days pending the resolution of the title dispute. It was the cruelest stroke he could have found, and he found it on purpose. Put the refuge out first, scatter the thrown-away women and children Eleanor had gathered, empty the mountain of the very thing that made it worth saving. And then whatever a Denver court decided, months later the damage was done and the point was made. This is what happens to a woman who counts. The paper came up the mountain in the hands of a sheriff's deputy who could not meet Eleanor's eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he mumbled. "It's a lawful order. 3 days, all of you. I got no choice in it." And Eleanor stood on the porch of the home she'd built with a dozen frightened faces gathered behind her in the doorway. The women, the children, the boys. Nobody had wanted all of them watching to see whether the one place that had ever taken them in was about to be taken away. And she felt the whole weight of it settle on her. She could not outlawyer a stamped order in 3 days. She could not get Coyne back from Denver in time. Everything she'd built could be scattered to the wind by a piece of paper before the truth ever caught up. And that was when Harlan Whitaker climbed the mountain road. Eleanor hadn't seen her father in months. He'd testified against Crane like he'd sworn to every word, and then he'd gone quiet. And she'd heard he was working. Actually working a hired hand on the widow Sledge's returned farm. Sober, saying little, a man doing the long, slow labor of becoming someone he could live with. She had not gone to see him. She hadn't been ready. She wasn't sure she ever would be. But here he came up her road on foot, hat in his hands, and behind him, Eleanor's breath caught behind him, came others. The widow Sledge, old Pruitt, and his nephew Tom. The man who'd told his wife to get the box off the mantel. A dozen families then, 2 dozen, then more than she could count climbing the mountain road toward the refuge, a whole valley on the move. "What is this?" Eleanor said, coming down off the porch. "Pa, what have you done?" "Ain't done nothing but talk, girl," Harlan said, and his voice was steadier than she'd ever heard it. "Turns out, that's a thing I'm finally good for." He turned and gestured at the crowd still climbing. "That eviction paper says 3 days to clear the mountain. Well," his weathered face set, "we come to make it hard. All of us. You put 40 families out of their homes at dawn a year ago, and this valley stood on its porches and wouldn't move on account of you. So we figured we'd return the favor. That deputy wants to clear this mountain." Harlan looked at the sheriff's man who had gone pale. "He's going to have to clear the whole valley off at first, and we don't move easy anymore. You taught us that." Eleanor could not speak. "There's more." Harlan said quieter now just for her, and he reached into his coat and brought out something wrapped in oilcloth, and his hands shook as he held it. I've been carrying this a long while, waiting till I had the sand to give it to you. Reckon now's the time. He unwrapped it. It was a bundle of papers, old and yellowed and careful kept. Your mama's things. I kept 'em when she passed. Couldn't look at 'em, couldn't throw 'em out. But last month I finally opened 'em, and Eleanor... His voice broke. Your mama kept records, same as you. She had a head for it, same as you got from her, and she wrote down every dealing this family ever had, including... He tapped the bundle. Including the deed to a piece of land your granddaddy left her. Land on this very mountain. The lower 40 where your garden sits now. Eleanor's whole world tilted. What are you saying, Pa? I'm saying Caleb Thornton bought the upper mountain 40 acres at a time and filed every parcel like an honest man. Harlan pressed the bundle into her hands. But the lower 40, the piece the refuge sits on, the piece with your garden and your school, that was never Crane's to threaten and never Vance's to steal, because it never belonged to the mountain's public claim at all. It was your mother's. Deeded clear, filed proper 40 years back before Vance ever held his seal. And now, his eyes filled, now it's yours. It's been yours all along. I just been too much of a coward to give you the one thing your mama left you. Eleanor stared at the papers in her hands. Her mother's careful hand. The same hand that had taught her figures at 8 years old, reaching across 20 years and the grave, to hand her daughter the ground beneath her own feet. You can't evict me off my own land, she said slowly, understanding, rising in her like a tide. Vance's whole claim rests on the mountain being unowned, but if even one piece of it is deeded clear, filed 40 years before he ever held office in a record his seal never touched, then his whole claim's a lie he can't cover, Harlan said. Because he can't lose a deed that's already in the county court's oldest books from before his time. It breaks the story. A land commissioner who says the mountain was never owned, standing next to a 40-year-old filed deed proving it was, that's not a title dispute anymore, girl. That's the seal itself caught in the fraud. Eleanor looked from the papers to her father, to the valley climbing her mountain road, to stand between her home and a stamped eviction, and something enormous broke open in her chest. Pa, she whispered. I know it don't fix it, Harlan said quickly, stepping back, hat in his hands. I know there's no fixing what I did to you on that platform. I ain't asking you to forgive it. I'm just... He couldn't finish. I'm just trying to be at the end of my life a little bit of the man your mama thought I could be. That's all. That's the whole of it. And Eleanor Whitaker, who had promised herself she would never lie to a broken man to make him feel better, who had held her forgiveness back for a year, because it had to be earned and not given. Eleanor looked at her father standing there, having climbed her mountain with a valley at his back, and her mother's last gift in his shaking hands, and she found that somewhere in the year of building and healing and becoming, without her ever deciding it, the forgiveness had grown. She crossed the distance between them, and she put her arms around her father for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, and she felt him break down against her. This ruined, weeping man who had sold her and come back to help save her. And she held him up the way no one had ever held her up before. Caleb Thornton reached out a hand at a loading dock. It's a start, Pa, she said into his shoulder. It's a start. That's all any of us get. The eviction's deadline came 2 mornings later, and Ezra Vance did not send one nervous deputy this time. He sent the sheriff himself with 6 men and a wagon to haul out whatever wouldn't walk, because a land commissioner with a scraped record book knew his only hope now was to make the eviction a fact. Before the truth reached Denver, an emptied mountain is a hard thing for any court to unempty. They found the mountain road blocked by the whole valley, not with guns. That was the thing Eleanor had drilled into every soul who'd climbed up to stand with her. No weapons, no threats. Nothing a paid sheriff could call a riot and answer with a rope. Just people. 200 of them more standing shoulder to shoulder across the road and up the slopes on either side. Families who'd been robbed for 20 years standing between a bought sheriff and the one woman who'd fought back. Clear the road, the sheriff called, and his voice didn't carry the way he wanted it to. This is a lawful order, Every one of you standing here's obstructing. Then arrest us." It was old Pruitt who said it, stepping forward with Tom at his side. "All 200. You got a wagon big enough, 'cause we ain't moving, and neither's she, and you're going to have to explain to a federal marshal why you dragged a valley off a mountain for a land commissioner who's about to be arrested his own self." The sheriff's face went uncertain. Word of Coyne's ride to Denver had reached even him. Eleanor stepped up onto the porch rail where they could all see her, and she did not raise her voice because she'd learned a year ago that the quiet word cuts cleaner than the shout. "You served 40 families at dawn a year ago," she said to the sheriff, "and this valley wouldn't move, and you threw your papers in the dirt because you knew deep down whose side of it you were on. You know it now too. That order in your hand was signed by a thief to steal a mountain to punish a woman for the crime of catching him." She held his eyes. "You can enforce it. You've got the men. But every person on this road will remember which morning you chose, and so will the marshal riding back from Denver right now with a warrant for the man who signed your paper. So I'll ask you the same thing a stranger once asked a whole town about me." She let it land. "Is this really what you want to be? The man who cleared a refuge for Ezra Vance?" The sheriff sat his horse a long moment. Then he looked at the 200 faces, and at the woman on the porch rail, and he did the arithmetic every bought man eventually does. "Deadline's passed," he said gruffly, to no one in particular. "Reckon the order's stale. I'll take it up with the office." And he turned his men around and rode back down the mountain, and the valley did not roar this time. It let out something quieter and deeper. The long breath of people who'd learned at last that standing together worked. When Deputy Marshal Coyne came back up the mountain road 4 days later than the eviction's deadline because a valley of families had made the mountain impossible to clear, and the sheriff had thought better of it, he came with a federal warrant for Ezra Vance and a face like a thundercloud. Denver moved fast for Denver. Coyne told them standing in Caleb's yard with the whole refuge and half the valley gathered round. "Turns out your proof was too clean to sit on Miss Whitaker. A territorial land commissioner running a 20-year fraud with a jailed businessman. That's the kind of thing makes careers in Washington." They sent auditors. They opened the master records under federal seal. He almost smiled. "And you know what they found in the official book right where Caleb Thornton's 20 years of deeds should have been?" "Nothing," Eleanor said. "He erased them. Blank pages. Scraped clean. In Vance's own office under Vance's own seal." Coyne shook his head. "A land commissioner can lose a deed. What he can't do is explain 20 years of scraped pages to a federal auditor with your accounting in his other hand, showing exactly which deeds went missing and exactly which ones benefited Josiah Crane. Vance is finished. Crane's finished. Every foreclosure the two of them ran is under federal review, and every family they robbed is going to get looked at fair for the first time in 20 years. He looked at the crowd at the valley, at the woman standing in the middle of it. "And it's all because one woman wouldn't stop counting." The valley roared the way it had roared a year before, and this time Eleanor let it wash over her and didn't go still because she'd learned in the year between how to stand inside a good thing and let herself feel it. Vance's claim on the mountain collapsed the moment the fraud came out, and Eleanor's mother's 40-year-old deed to the lower 40 stood exactly as Harlan had promised. Clear-filed, untouchable hers. Caleb's 20 years of receipts matched against the scraped pages proved the upper mountain his beyond any court's doubt. The refuge was safe. Not just safe, safe forever, in a way it had never quite been, because now the whole territory knew its story, and there is no thief so bold he'll go after a place 100 newspapers have made famous. She saw Josiah Crane one last time. The federal court called her to Denver to give her accounting in person at the joint trial of Crane and Vance. And Eleanor went. She, who had never been farther than Fairplay in her life, rode into the biggest city she'd ever seen, and walked into a federal courtroom in a new dress. The widow Sledge had sewn her, and she laid out 20 years of two men's fraud so plainly that the prosecutor said afterward he'd never needed a witness less and wanted one more. Crane was thinner. Jail does that. But his eyes found her across the courtroom, the way they had across the smoke of his burning ledgers, and when the court recessed, he was allowed briefly to speak, and he turned that flat, cold look on the woman who had ended him. "You know what I can't understand. Crane said quiet, just for her in the moment before the marshals took him back. "I've beaten senators, bankers, men with armies of lawyers, 20 years and no one ever laid a glove on me." His jaw worked. "And it was you. A woman her own father sold off a loading dock for $50. How?" Eleanor looked at him a long moment. She felt no fear now. She hadn't for a year. And she found looking at the ruined man who had once made the cold go all the way down to her feet that she didn't even feel triumph. She just felt the plain, clean truth of it, and she gave it to him straight. "Because you all made the same mistake," she said. "Every one of you. My father, the town you Vance. You looked at me and decided what I was worth, and then you stopped looking. That's the whole trick of it, Mr. Crane. You spent so long being sure I was nothing that you never once thought to check." She stepped back. "You didn't lose to an army. You lost to the one person you were too proud to watch. And that's the last figure I'll ever add up for you." She turned to go, then paused. $50. That was your valuation of me near enough. I hope you think about it every day of the life you'll spend in there. I know I earned it back with interest." She walked out of the courtroom and did not look back, and she never saw Josiah Crane again, and she never once wondered what became of him, because he had ceased entirely to be a thing that could touch her. They married at the summer's turn, as they'd planned, in the front room of the house that was now a school and a refuge and a home, with the whole valley crowded in and spilling out the doors. The widow Sledge stood up with Eleanor. Amos gave the bride away and cried the whole time, and pretended he didn't. Tom Pruitt rang a bell he'd hung in a tree, and Harlan Whitaker sat in the front row, sober and weeping and proud. A father watching his daughter marry a good man in the very life she'd built out of the wreckage he'd made of her, and Eleanor had asked him to be there, which was its own kind of miracle, and the deepest proof that a start given time can become something more. There was no scene of a loading dock in any of it. There was no price. There was only a woman who'd once been sold for $50, standing in a room full of people, who loved her marrying the first man who'd ever asked her what she wanted. It was a full year to the day after the auction. Eleanor realized it that evening, the arithmetic surfacing, the way it always did when she and Caleb sat out on the porch, married now, the refuge quiet and full behind them, the valley's lights just visible far below. Caleb was turning something over in his hands. His hat, she saw. He always turned his hat when he had something to say. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked her quiet. The square, the platform, the whole of it. Eleanor was quiet a moment. "Every day," she said. "Not the way you'd think. Not with the old shame. I used to carry that day like a stone in my chest. $50. The faces. My own father's hand held out for the coins." She looked out over the valley she'd saved. "Yes, Caleb. I think about it every single day. Because that was the day everyone in my whole world decided out loud in front of God, and everybody, that I had no value at all." She turned to look at him, and there were tears standing in her eyes, but she was smiling the whole unguarded smile she'd never once had before she came up this mountain. "And it was the day I learned they were every last one of them wrong." Caleb reached over and took her hand the way he'd first reached up to help her down off a platform a year and a lifetime ago, steady, calloused, asking nothing. "They were wrong," he agreed. "They were wrong about all of it," Eleanor said. "My father priced me." The town laughed. Crane feared me and Vance tried to bury me, and every one of them was working off the same lie that a person's worth is whatever the world will pay for them. That you can stand a body up in a square and put a number on her. She shook her head slow. "But that's not where worth lives. It never was. My mother knew it. She tried to tell me before she died. It took me 25 years and a stranger's shocking question to finally believe her." She squeezed his hand. "A person's worth isn't in what the world will give for them. It's in what they refuse to let the world take. Below them in the house full of the thrown away and the taken in." A child laughed in her sleep, and a woman who'd once flinched at every raised voice hummed as she banked the fire, and a mountain that had held one lonely man for 20 years held a whole family. Now in the door on every room locked from the inside, and every key hung on its own nail waiting for the day its owner would leave it there and finally sleep, The town of Dust Creek does not call Eleanor Whitaker by the cruel names anymore. They stopped one by one over that long year as the story of what she'd done ran through the territory and doubled back on them. Now when they speak of her at all, they speak of her the way you speak of the one good thing that came out of your town's worst hour. They call her the woman who gave a whole valley back its voice. The woman who reads figures no man can hide from. The woman who takes in the ones the world throws away. And on the day they finally understood what she'd become standing in a square where they'd once tried to sell her, they gave her the only name that ever fit the woman they mocked, who became the woman they needed. Because sometimes the person the world weighs and prices and casts aside as worthless is carrying unseen inside her the exact thing that world will one day be saved by. And every soul who ever looked at Eleanor Whitaker and saw only $50 had it backwards from the very start. The world does not decide what you are worth. You do, and the moment you refuse to let it be taken from you, no man alive, however rich, however cruel, however sure, can ever price you again.